All right, welcome everybody to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It is good to be with you today. We are doing a little bit of a different project here, so welcome everybody in the chat. Um, Make sure to like, share, subscribe, support the Patreon. This is kind of like an additional study group because the Lenin study group filled up really fast, and there's a lot of people that didn't end up being able to get in on that. And another thing that you know this is another book that I thought would be really interesting to talk about, very different. But the guest that we have today, is a good friend of mine, Stephen Osuna. Folks have probably seen him or heard him on the podcast before. We did an episode. We've done a few episodes, one on one with Josh on class suicide and Amilcar Cabral, one on the Mao's piece on the correct handling of contradictions among the people, which will definitely come up, I think, at a certain point during our discussion of this text as well. And then we've done some stuff on the Imperial 80s. We did Predator. Steven was supposed to join us for WrestleMania, but unfortunately wasn't able to make that one. But let me just say a couple things about Stephen before I bring him up. So Stephen teaches, researches, and writes as an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Cal State, now Long Beach. He's a scholar of political economy, racism, policing, and criminalization in the U.S., Mexico, and Central America. He was born and raised in Echo Park in Los Angeles, the son of Mexican and Salvadoran working class migrants, over 20 years of teaching in a public school setting. And you can read the rest of his bio there, but he believes that public education is a terrain of ideological struggle that cannot be abandoned. And he's written in a number of different journals and volumes, including The Futures of Black Radicalism, Policing the Planet, Why the Policing Crisis Led to Black Lives Matter. So, Stephen, I'm going to bring you up to the stage now. How you doing, man?
All right. Good. How you doing? Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for those that are in the East Coast.
Yeah.
Doing well.
So let's just talk a little bit before we get into this section about, kind of like what we want to do through reading this text and why do it. And I'll say a couple of things up front for me just quickly. One is that Cedric Robinson, obviously, in his work is the subject of much debate after his passing, basically, right? Like there's kind of a lot of people that uphold particularly Black Marxism as a, really important text. And then there's a lot of people who really don't like that book. That's interesting. There's been a whole lot of discussion about that on kind of both sides of the debate. A lot of it I feel like is quite polemical on both sides and doesn't engage in a substantive fashion a lot of the time, but there are critiques of it that I agree with, and there are people who uplift some of its contributions that I also agree with, right? Is kind of where I stand on it. But I think one of the more frustrating things for me in a lot of that back and forth is that the people engaging with it don't, on either side of the debate, in my opinion, don't seem to have a good handle on what Robinson's critiques or understandings of Marxism actually are, right? And I don't think you necessarily get that from Black Marxism, because the only place in Black Marxism where he really deals with Marxism is through the three, Black Marxist public intellectuals, Du Bois, C.L.R. James, and Richard Wright, and Robinson's read on how they were treated by other communists, what their relationship was to the different party formations they were a part of, in some cases why they left them, right, and so on. And this book that we're going to talk about over these 4 sessions, Anthropology of Marxism, I think gives a much better understanding of what Robinson actually thinks about Marxism. It also deals with the kind of one of the polemical things that you hear from people who are sometimes pro-Robinson but anti-Marx, right, is that if you read Black Marxism, it shows you that you don't need to read Marx if you're a Black person. And
Yeah.
so don't worry, because obviously Robinson didn't think that or do that, right? He read a lot of Marx, Lenin, Engels, and he had opinions that he developed about this stuff, as well as did a lot of research around the people that influenced them or, people who were influenced by them, right? And so through this book, we'll see some of that and see what some of the issues that what he has are. And I think the last thing I'd say quickly before I pass it to you is just that I think one of the reasons I wanted to do this with you is that for both of us, the Marxist tradition in its different forms has a lot of value and is something that we do seek to continue to use what we see as tools that come out of this tradition. And so, to the extent that he has critiques that are important for us to be aware of, we have to kind of decide, do we agree with them? Do we, disagree with them? And if we agree with them, have they already been addressed in different parts of the Marxist tradition, particularly ones taken up in the third world or by African or Latin American Marxists and all, or, Mao or on and on, right? Or are there ones that still need to be kind of addressed and still come up and we still see them? And one of the things that's interesting in this is I think a lot of what Robinson does point out through this book are different things that you see in what people now, Gabriel Rockhill, Domenico Lucerto, others would characterize as the Western Marxist, tradition, right? One of those being the messianism, right? The kind of looking for the Messiah and heaven and this kind of thing. Um, and so we can get into some of that because what's interesting about that is that also folks from that camp may also have critiques of Cedric Robinson, which is fine too. But that's, so that's kind of why I was interested is like that a lot of times the conversation, because it revolves so much around Black Marxism, doesn't really get to the analysis of Marxism that Cedric Robinson actually has, and us being able to kind of look through those critiques and analyses and see the extent to which we think that there's value in them and need to be addressed and so on.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, I'm happy to do this with you. I'm glad you invited me. At this book, I read it back like 2000, maybe 10, 12. It was like a PDF copy before they did the second edition. I didn't have an actual copy of it. A friend of mine, shout out to Daniel Olmos, I think gave me a copy of it through PDF, and it was like really hard to read, but it was I was in grad school in Santa Barbara at the time with, learning from Cedric. And I was able to read this book, and I came in to grad school, already, having not, I would say well versed, and just having an understanding of Marxism, but in praxis, right? The idea of learning it from a organization, and so that's how I entered in reading Cedric and reading the critiques he had of Marxism and Marx. And so it wasn't like coming in and just having like a blind eye view of it. I was actually well versed with it. And so then reading his critiques, I never read it as like anti-Marxist or anti-communist, right? I just read it more like this is a criticism, and this is a criticism that is very important to think about, to sit with, right? And I sat with it, and I've sat with it for multiple years now, to this day I still sit with these critiques, right? But this book specifically, Anthropology of Marxism, again, his criticisms that are there, but it also shows you his openness to socialism, right? And this is the part where for me was very important, right? This book's very important to read. But again, it provides a criticism that maybe some of us on the Marxist tradition will take very defensively, right? You already put on your gloves on when some of the people that read it already put their gloves on, ready to fight when they're reading the book, right? Rather than really trying to see what it's trying to argue, what it's trying to press us to think about and think through, and in this moment, I think it's really important to read it and just think through it, collectively. And I hope others that are watching have read it or sit with us and listen to it and are interested in reading more of it with us, right? Again, like I said, I as someone that uses a Marxist approach to their scholarship, to their thinking of the world, to their teaching, to their organizing that I've been a part of. This hasn't steered me away from Marx, right? This hasn't pushed me away from Marxism or the different Marxisms that exist throughout the world, right? It's actually opened it up more to think about more critically when I'm thinking about my approach, right? Stuart Hall's has this piece called Marxism Without Guarantees, which I think is very, in this approach, right? That there is no deterministic approach to Marxism. And if we really read Marxism seriously, and as we should, there is no determination, right? It's constantly open, and it opens the terrain for us to understand what we're up against, right? Marcel Perret and Zachary Levinson have an essay comparing Stuart Hall and Robinson, which I think is interesting to look at these two authors of Race and Class, right? And again, as someone that one of the first places I wanted to publish as a scholar was Race and Class, and Cedric's all over that journal, Race and Class, right? That's an important journal for our understanding of a materialist analysis, and he was part of that tradition, So when folks really read him and think of just read Black Marxism and say this was what he thought and that's it, and don't read all the other books we read, like Forgeries of Memory of Meaning, right? Anthropology of Marxism, and all the multiple essays, the essay on Frantz Fanon that I think was a very important essay. You'll be able to see the different approaches he has, and also the things you might not agree with. Again, that Black Marxism, as I was reading it, there's like a lot of things I don't agree with because of my understanding of Marx and Marxism, and my relationship to Marxism emerging from the third world, right? So, I think that's an important thing. But I wanted to share before we get into the thing, the picture you have that you created, the flyer. So look at that. I had a friend named Lauren do this for me. So, I subscribe to these ideas of these dudes, right? So I have it even painted right here, right? I should just put it back here next to as I'm talking, right? But again, I think Cedric's ideas really encourage us to think critically of this approach. And so I think for me, he was a radical scholar who wanted us to think critically of the things we're reading. And going back to Marx's idea of a ruthless criticism of everything existing, right? And again, you might be wrong in your criticism, but at least you're attempting to provide an alternative view of what we're working with, right? So,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that's clear, right? And I mean, there's some things, kind of as we move into the text, you get early on his mention that there are studies of Marx and Marxism, but he's like, most of it is hagiography, right? And I mean, I would add I would add to that most of it, in my view, is probably antagonistic to Marx, but among those that uphold socialism or a Marxist viewpoint, it is probably lifting him up in this kind of way. And we can as we get into like the piece from Lenin that he kind of focuses this early section of the book around, when you read that, which I'll put in the show description, it's there. I mean, Marx brought the he brought the good word, right? He brought the doctrine. It is almost in some ways like Moses with the tablets, in the way that that Lenin kind of references him in that document. And we could talk when we get to that piece. I'll talk about that a little bit more, because I think that there's also within all these pieces, and this is something I don't think Robinson does sometimes, is you have to actually situate the piece you're talking about in terms of what was that piece for? What was it written in? Who was it addressing? Like, what was the purpose of it? As opposed to looking at all of these, at every piece of Marxist writing, regardless of who did it, as being based on a kind of scholarly truth-seeking endeavor, right? Because sometimes it's not that. Sometimes it's like, hey, it's the halftime show and we need to rally the team, right? Sometimes it's like, so there's different purposes, I think, for different writing, and I think that provides a level of context that sometimes I think in some of these sections of what we read for today, I don't think Robinson really even notes that, which is interesting to me. And I don't know if that's because, I don't imagine it's because he's not aware of it, but it is interesting that it's kind of omitted from the analysis.
Yeah, yeah. That's a good point. And I think again, like we were talking about right before we started, that a lot of the writings of like Lenin, a lot of the writings of Marx and Engels, they're writing for political organizations, right? Or they're writing towards that ends, as opposed to some of us are writing more for academic texts, right? But but I do what I do appreciate though in that sense then is that we do, while these things are written for organizations, that were written for trying to understand the political analysis of the moment, he's at least reading them as intellectual texts and not just that, right? And so like seeing them as valuable, right? And so if they are valuable, let's critique them as they're valuable, right? And so let's build off of them as they're valuable. So in that sense, I do think that's important. And as we were talking about that and thinking about, you're saying like Mao said this or Lenin said that, I think I have these two next to me in front of me because I think about organizational texts, right? So like fundamentals of political economy, right? And this is all from Foreign Languages Press. There you go, right? The Marxist-Leninism, Maoism basic course, right? These texts right here, again, I think they're really useful for those of us that are like, if we're reading this book, we should have these books aside with next to us to think about how what he's talking about, you see it in this text, right? Like this one provides what we're going to get into about French socialism, English political economy. This is how they basically frame it, right? And this is the Indian communists, right? The Maoists. So I think these texts are important to read them alongside each other. And I think that you were saying, that you're reading this book at the same time that you're reading Lenin's Imperialism, and that's how I think they should be read, right? I don't think I fundamentally disagree with those that say that Cedric Robinson had these critiques of Marx, so I mean we shouldn't read Marxism anymore. Like get rid of that. That's a total mistake. And I have to say that as someone that sat with Cedric, that was taking classes with him, right? That wasn't the approach, right? It was that you should be reading these people, you should be reading these texts. Read me, but you should be reading these texts in general, right? If you read Gramsci, you should still read Marx, right? And going back to that point, I think Gramsci in the Prison Notebooks, he talks about like that just like Saint Peter was bringing up Jesus, Lenin was bringing up Marx. I mean, Engels was bringing up Marx. Stalin was bringing up Lenin, right? So you have to continue this approach, right? You have the Communist Party of Peru bringing up Mao and Maoism, right? So you have these different moments where people are like almost like the idea of hagiography, right? That we have to be careful with.
Yeah, but I mean, on the flip side of that too, and it's something I think that we have to wrestle with as we go through this text, right? Is like, and it's something I don't know that Robinson wrestled with this adequately because he wasn't in a revolutionary party or a big organization. I know that he organized. I know he was an activist. I know he did a lot of like dope journalism with movements and things like that, right? But you do have to think about these questions of like what actually gives you that in to motivate and tap into the masses and like direct their energy in very just incredibly difficult circumstances, right? Because if you're part of these movements, like you could face death, you could face the killing of your, so it's like that's not an easy sort of question, and it's not necessarily one I think that is solely answered by, political economy and, or even like by just having truth claims that are 100% accurate, right? Because I think there's limits to the motivations that can come about from revealing to people the nature of the world that they live in, that we have to have more than just that. So, all right, let's dig in. I have notes early on. I'm sure you do too. Yeah. Do you want to start with this kind of first section? So the first chapter is called Coming to Terms with the Marxian Taxonomy. He comes right off the bat, like kind of complicating the question of the proletariat as the revolutionary agent of the French Revolution in particular. I have some notes here, but I wondered if you had some to start us off.
Well, it starts off with this idea, right? According to legend, right? So like this construction that he already starts off with that sentence, right? Like it's kind of like, this is the story that we've been told, right? That this is the French Revolution is kind of like the point of starting us off, right? And again, it goes back to what you were saying earlier, right? at that moment when these dudes are writing, they have to look at a moment to like specify, okay, this is the moment that we should be looking at, this historical moment, you know. And you think of different revolutionary movements, we think about how we tell our story of the history, right? You know, I think of El Salvador, we think of 1932, the massacre, we think of the Civil War in the 80s, right? These different moments, different struggles that shape the what we're going to be arguing, right? And so here he's arguing, right, this idea that the creation of the proletariat emerges during the French Revolution. This is the legend that we've been told about the development of the proletariat, and he's starting for us to start thinking critically. Is it really, you know, does it deserve this credit to building a revolutionary process, right? The proletariat amongst all working classes, right? So again, if we just, because some of us, when we think of the term proletariat, we expand it. You know, I tend to, I remember when I first read the Communist Manifesto when I was 18, I read proletariat and I was like, that's my mom, the domestic worker. But for some, that's not the proletariat. The proletariat is the industrial worker, not the domestic worker. But when I read it, I was like, that's my mom. My mom is the proletariat, right? And so, but here he's arguing that for some, the proletariat was the industrial worker, and it left out my mom. It left out the domestic working women, right? And so does that then create, is that a misrepresentation of how we should think of revolution in them, right? So he's already starting us off thinking about how we think in this moment, right? But, you know, he goes back to this point that the ultimate objective of Marxian, the ultimate Marxian objective, the recovery of human life from the spoilage of degradation, retains its urgency, right? So again, despite there might be this myth being created, what it's arguing at its fundamentals, it's urgent. This construction of socialism is urgent, right? And just to build off of that, I did want to quote, and we're going back to this, we're talking about Black Marxism, right? But there's a quote in Black Marxism that I did want to start us off with, and I forgot to add before as we were talking, but that kind of gets us into this point, right? And it says, this is page 288 of Black Marxism. Marxism was and remains a superior grammar for synthesizing the degradation of labor with the growing destabilization of capitalist production and accelerating technological development. The increasing resort to state coercion, mediated by bureaucratic rationalism, the strangulation of whole regions, most of them formerly colonies, through pricing mechanisms, market manipulation, monopolization of advanced technology, the international organization of production, international banking, military assistance, and the stultifying dependencies of monocultural economics, right? So again, this superior grammar still is important for us to understand through the Marxist lens, but then he gets into, okay, but what are the limits? What are the gaps? And this is where he starts us off in this section, right? Where he, you know, so yeah, I'll let you go.
No, I think that's a great introduction. I mean, I think the question around the proletariat, you know, is a very important one. You see a lot of debates about this on the left still, among, and not just on the left, but among communists, right? Like, it, you know, in particular, like one that I can think of that was going around a lot, you know, a few years ago in particular, was like, are Starbucks baristas part of the proletariat or not, right? Like, this became like, for whatever reason, like people wanted to focus on this, probably as they were unionizing and all of this kind of stuff. And I mean, yeah, I mean, I tend to be like you and take a much more expansive line around this, but I think part of what's a little bit frustrating sometimes within the way Robinson deals with this is that he has a way of suggesting that, like, you know, Marx is glossing over something here, right? Or that that this construction of the proletariat as the industrial workers, when in French Revolution it included, you know, laborers, artisans, you know, like, so he points, he does this picture I could describe as manufacturers, actually the quote. But anyways, you know, the shopkeepers, peasants, the middle class leaders, craftsmen, right? So on and so forth, right? I mean, in a lot of ways, at the time of the French Revolution, that would have been, some of those people were middle class, right? But a lot of them are working class, right? Like, because not everybody is working in a factory. There aren't factories for every job and so on. So in a certain way, like, this is where something like, you know, social investigation, class analysis comes in for people who are engaged in struggle. Say, okay, what do people do? What is their relationship to the forces around them? Can we organize this into some kind of block or group, right, that is then able to challenge power, right, and effectively, you know, lead some kind of revolutionary struggle, right? Ultimately, so is what the goal is. And I mean, national liberation movements, this is like quite, you know, sometimes it includes parts of the national bourgeoisie, right? Because like they need those resources, they need access to some of those things in order to have that struggle. And so I guess in part what I'm saying is that this is a question that communists and communist movements are always kind of taking up and thinking about and arguing over.
That's right.
In a kind of dynamic process to produce the way that they're going to organize. And like, if we see this thinking through like Charisse Burton-Stelly and Jody Dean's work on Black women communists, they were the ones arguing, yeah, the domestic workers should be part of this, right? And there were people within the Communist Party that were saying, no, they're not, right? And we're not going to do that, you know? But that happens within the organizations, right? And so I think to the extent that what's useful, I guess, what's interesting, I guess, about this book in general is that Robinson is producing these critiques under, as you said, a rubric of believing in socialism, believing that by critiquing these things, we can find a kind of new or a better path to socialism. But I think he's right to critique communists for having some of these issues, because if they didn't have those issues, there wouldn't be those people that are arguing the other side of that thing. But I also think in many ways that, you know, communist parties and organizations are still the best tools to be able to potentially have that debate and lead to something, right?
That's right.
Which I'm not sure. I don't think Robinson felt that way necessarily. I'm not sure, but
no, the party organization, even for some Marxists, are already moving for at this moment, are not necessarily the approach at the moment, right? I'm with you though. And I think, you know, if we go back to the concept of the proletariat, why the proletariat at this moment, right? It's like the argument that Marxists were making was that because they're the ones that are working in collectively. They're the ones that are working in the factory setting. They're the ones that are organized in the factory setting. They're the ones, right? So it's like this organizational aspect of the proletariat in the factory setting allows for organization to develop, to build.
That's right.
Right? Collectively. That was the idea, right?
Yeah.
Again, where are the limits, though? Again, that you have others that are not fitting that frame, that were also rebelling, that were also fighting the terms of order in his ideas, right? That if you miss them, if you don't look at them, then you don't realize how broader of a movement you could have, right? Or the different alternative views that emerge out of that struggle, right? The different attempts of rebellion that might exist, right? This goes back to Fanon. This goes back, right? Amy Cecile, right? So I think those are like you said, those were the tensions that existed within party organizations that still exist to this day. As you bring up the Starbucks workers, the issue of organizing against police violence, right? Some organizations that's not necessarily part of the working class struggle. It's not labor based, right? Others are, so you need to amplify that, right? Again, the struggles of the global South and the global North, those debates that exist there, right? All these have existed within organizations, yeah. Now, obviously, he's going back to that moment and being like, okay, these dudes are writing at this moment, and focusing on the legend of the proletariat, right? And misrepresenting of those who oppose exploitation. So he has this phrase, a misrepresentation of those that were opposing it. And then, as you just said, later on, he mentions the shopkeepers and all these other dudes that were part of the middle class, middle strata. Let's choose that better, right? The middle strata of capital that were actually opposed to that moment, opposed to the exploitation that was happening at that time, right? But again, I think to the point, going back to this idea that despite these criticisms, right, again, this page one, it is still possible to distill from human experience a comprehension of just what is to be done. Part of that project may lie in the critique of Marxism itself, right? And so again, I don't know if he's playing on the words of what is to be done by Lenin, but this idea, right, that maybe moving forward to understand socialism, we need to look at how Marxism tells the story of itself, right? How has Marxism shaped itself? Kind of like he does political science with the terms of order. How has political science as a discipline told the story of itself? And I think that's really, really helpful sometimes to think about how we tell a story of ourselves, how we shape the narrative. I teach a critical criminology, radical criminology class. And one thing I tell my students is we need to learn how criminology has told the story of itself historically. How has it shaped itself, right? And so same thing with us. I have a self-criticism of how has Marxism shaped itself, right? How have we as Marxists told the story of ourselves and shaped ourselves, right? And I think that's important, for any movement, right? And this goes back to Amilcar Cabral's essay where he talks about, looking at the weaknesses within our own movements, right? And that's how we build power to build, right? So in this first paragraph that we haven't even left yet, this is where he's trying to get, this is what he's trying to get into, right? This legend of the proletariat, right? That we continue with, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'll note just on this is that I don't love his citations. So like one of the people he brings in here is what's his name? Oh, hang on, I have it here. William Reddy, Money and Liberty in Modern Europe, Critique of Historical Understanding. So this is a text that was written primarily to displace class struggle as the like kind of motive of historical struggle, right? And so this is where Robinson, I think, is influenced in certain ways by like post-structuralism and these kind of critiques of like every discipline we need to get into and kind of critique it down to its roots.
Yeah.
And look, there can be value there in doing that, but it can also lead to kind of postmodernism, right? Or to this like, if we critique all the disciplines and say that none of them matter or they're all built on bullshit foundations, which in some sense they kind of are, right? Like throughout, we could talk about anthropology, which is the tool that he's, talking about using here, right? And he acknowledges like, it has its own racism and all that kind of stuff in it. But at some point we have to say, okay, like, does this provide us with tools and analyses that are helpful to us in these struggles, or can we put them towards our aims? And I think being aware of the critiques and the blind spots of them is useful, to be clear. Like, it is very useful, because sometimes that stuff, like you said, it comes up when you're reading, a manual that's written for the Indian Communist Party or whatever, and you're like, oh, like they shouldn't be repeating this, like, necessarily, right? But on the flip side, you do have to kind of weigh that, I think. And one thing that Robinson does throughout a number of his texts is he will sometimes use what I consider to be kind of bourgeois sources to critique Marxists, and saying like, look, this scholarship basically is superior and it proves that this is wrong, and it's like, I think, to me, I'm like, I don't trust the motivations of those people necessarily with their scholarship in the same way, right? Whereas, like, I think Robinson is motivated by the right things in the right way, but I think sometimes when he brings in some of those other people as his citations, I'm like, I don't want to take that person's word for it, but you're taking that person's word for it in a certain way.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's true. It's true, right? Because again, for me, like, if he's using these scholars, right, or he's using these people that are more bourgeois scientists, right, but then he's critiquing these bourgeois scientists, right? It misses the mark for me, because again, like, why not just critique the Marxism with then just by on its own, right? You don't got to bring these other dudes. You don't got to bring these bourgeois scientists. If you find, because you're already finding the gaps, you don't got to go over there with the bourgeois scientists. Just stick to the text that you're looking at, right? specifically these of Lenin, Lenin's, Engels, and Marx, right? Maybe if we would have brought in Mao, it would have been different, but he doesn't bring Mao. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that if I were doing the project, right, the people that I would use to critique some of these things would be Amilcar Cabral, it would be Fanon, it would be Mao, it would be, right, it would be other folks within the tradition that actually in certain cases make similar arguments or the same argument, right, but are doing it like, we can't do it this way because our revolution isn't going to work if we do it this way. Like I think of one of the conversations I had, I think it was with Alyssa Trotz, and we were talking about Ndiaye and Walter Rodney in Guyana. And, you know, that there were people that were communists, right, in Guyana, and they would say, well, you know, we have to organize around the industrial proletariat, so we're just going to organize the one factory that exists on the island, basically, right? Like, and it's like 80-90% of the workers don't work in those settings, right? But like, you're so focused on this kind of doctrine that I can't. So then people would leave the Communist Party and organize in other ways, right? Because it didn't make any sense what was being proposed by the communists in that setting, right? And so, in that sense, I totally get it. I see the utility. I understand it, but I think having more of those global South experiences and discussions would enrich it in a way. But on the same point, or I mean, to make the kind of counterpoint, I think Robinson's very interested in this book in delving into Europe, which, you know, is the thing actually he's critiqued quite often of sort of like he hates Western civilization and Europe and everything, right?
But here he has a whole book on Europe, 2 books actually.
Yeah, I think that's what Josh Myers pointed out once, is that, like, you know, about half of his writing on the whole basically is about Europe, and like about Europe in ways that most people don't go that deep on. But
and that's the point, right? I guess that you're saying that these people he's citing are the ones that are actually talking about Europe, right? You know, he's because of the Marxists we're talking about weren't talking about Europe. They were trying to understand the political moment in their own place, right? Their own terrain. You know, because I was thinking of the different debates that were happening in El Salvador, for example, against the different organizations, whether you take up armed struggle or you do the electoral route, right? And those debates were very important that fit into this book, right? Or the struggles of Jose Carlos Mariátegui talking about socialism in Peru, how they can look very different from a European socialism. All these different approaches that exist with the Marxist canon in Latin America. Had all these different critiques that he could actually have incorporated the Zapatistas, whether you agree with them or not. They had these different critiques, right? So I think, those could have been different citations, but that's the point. I think you hit it on the nail on the head, right? That he's looking at Europe, and maybe these folks that he's citing, you know, are the ones that were looking at that moment as far back. Right?
So let's move on a little bit. So so he moves into really this piece, which is very important for this section of the book, which is Lenin, 3 sources and 3 components of Marxism. And I'll just say for folks,
before you go there though,
yeah,
anthropology. Why anthropology? Why is he using anthropology as a method here?
Yeah, what do you think?
Well, you know, he says, right, that this has a awful history, right? It studies human groups, societies, civilizations, but it's always studied the other, right? It's a colonial enterprise that studies. He doesn't say it's a colonial enterprise, but we're saying it. It studies the outside world, right? But it's never done it towards Europe. You know, so that's to me something that's interesting to think about, that he's actually doing an anthropology of Europe, right? He's like using the methods of anthropology to study Europe, right? But specifically study Marxism. But he again says, you know, anthropology is short of disruptive collective action or revolutionary change. It's never really about revolutionary change. Anthropology as a study, right? But again, he says it's an appropriate vantage point to look at. So I think for me, it's like he's using these methods to study Europe. You know, that usually it's been studied Africa or the Latin American civilization societies, but never Europe itself, right? And so then, you know, I wanted to pull out a quote on page 2, right, before it goes into this. But before I get into that, though, anything else you want to say about anthropology? Pretty much.
No, not really. I mean, obviously it has its you know, its racist origins. I do think it's interesting, obviously, to kind of turn it on its head. And that's what it's one of the things that's consistent within Robinson's, like, terms of order is like sort of using the tools of political science to try to dismantle political science as an entire, discipline, basically. Um, so I guess my only thing about it in general is the challenges of doing work like this within an academic setting, published on an academic press, I think what's interesting about this book, my understanding is this was kind of like a course reader, or was a course he actually taught at some point.
That's what I heard. Yeah, that's what I heard too. Yeah. It was a seminar. It was a graduate seminar that he was teaching.
Yeah, which is cool.
I think nobody wanted to publish it. That's what I heard.
Yeah.
Nobody wanted to publish it, and then he published it like in a, it wasn't like one of those like top journal, top.
I know,
university presses, right?
It's the funny thing about, I think he would be quite shocked to know that he's the subject of this much debate and that his work is like taking on all this stuff now because nobody was paying attention for most of his life.
No, and but it goes back to that point that he would be, if he's critical of hagiography, he would also be critical of people trying to put him on a pedestal, right? And so like it's not what we're trying to do here either. Or that's not what I would want to do, But it goes back to this this quote I wanted to cite on page 2, right? And this is pretty much what he's trying to. There's another part later on in the book, in the chapter, he makes the argument, but it is kind of like what this book's going to be about. He says, quote, "In this study, I shall demonstrate that both Western socialism and historical materialism were each an expression of the ferment of a civilization rather than the simple products of a particular event, say the French Revolution, a specific era, industrial capitalism, or a select intellectual cohort, the Hegelians." Right? And for me, when I first read that, and I think of it now today, I just think it's really important because, the hagiography part is very dangerous, and especially in this setting that I'm in of academia and around intellectuals, where we tend to, and this kind of that book, the Western Marxism book that just came out, right? Putting the ideas in contexts, in the writings of people in the historical context and products of their conditions rather than as individual geniuses, right? And for me, that's the idea of socialism doesn't belong to one person or one idea or one individual that wrote it. It belongs to the masses. And to me, that's when and again, that's my take when I read this, right? That the socialism belongs to all of us, right? It doesn't belong to one individual that wrote it, to one that whose name is on Marx or Lenin or Mao. It belongs to the masses. And I think, for me, I think Marx would have said the same thing, right? I think Lenin and Mao would have said the same thing. The fact that they used their names is after the fact, right? And so I think that when I read this part, that socialism emerges out of a response in Europe, a response to the degradation of humanity, right? The misery that was emerging out of the ending towards feudalism and the rise of capitalism. That it was a response to that. And so to me, that was an important moment, an important part of this text.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think, I mean, there is the whole, he talks about the presented in the scientific narrative of discovery and this kind of thing. Like, there is this, and this is one of the things, obviously, he's critiquing. We'll get into it more in a second here. But this idea that Marx discovered or invented something kind of like, and the way that gets discussed sort of leads people to believe that he did that. What he and Engels were doing was something totally new, rather than pulling from different component parts where it was already, that like you said, that there was a whole bunch of shit going on, basically, that contributed to that. Yeah. So one of the things, quickly for the folks in the chat, I see a lot of good questions. We're gonna try to save the questions for towards the end, but I will try to capture the ones that you ask as we go along. So then we do get to this point of him bringing up this canon for the study of classical Marxism or the science of socialism, and he cites Lenin's review of a contribution to the critique of political economy, or the Grundrisse, the anti-Dühring texts, right? And then he goes to Lenin, right, because Lenin kind of distills it in this essay that he cites, which I've added these to the show description, but it's 3 sources and 3 components of Marxism. It's a short piece. As I said, it's published on the 30th anniversary of Marx's passing, and it's published in I can't pronounce this, but basically a Russian communist outlet, like that's also, we should say, banned by the czar too, right? So it's like not even, it's kind of, it's an illegal communist newspaper, I guess is the way to think about it within Russia at the time. It's in 1913, so it's prior to the Russian Revolution, and it does a lot of things, but basically it says, Marx brought us scientific socialism, which is the tool for our liberation. And basically, as Robinson points out, Lenin says, and Engels has certain representations of this within his own work that are a little bit different, but says that essentially, I'll look for the quote, but Lenin was responding to the questions raised by the foremost minds, essentially. And so the thing about Marxism, right, was that it kind of answered the questions by these greatest sort of bourgeois scholars, but that the things that he focuses on are English political economy, German philosophy, and French socialism as the sources of Marxism, and the things that produced then later, which we'll talk about more partly in this section and partly probably next week, are the component parts of Marxism, or the things that come out of it. And so there's an issue that Robinson raises around nationalism here that I'm still trying to kind of understand what he's getting at, but I get it on one level, because what he's saying is Marxists say that, culture, the superstructure, right, that these things are a product of the mode of production. And so if you say that, and the mode of production is the same in these different places, then what's the point of saying French socialism, German German philosophy, and these other things, because we recognize these national categories as bourgeois, kind of mystifications, which is interesting because actually that's something Lenin wrote about quite a bit. Like if you go into his writings on nationalism, he's very aware that using those categories is a bourgeois, that's bourgeois ideology. On the other side, though, there is the whole question of like culture and language. And this is where the national question is this messy thing that communists spent a lot of time, trying to resolve their position on. Because if people are all writing in French, right, or they're all writing in German, then the people who are writing in the same language as each other are going to have a certain discourse with one another, and they may not have the same discourse with people that are writing in a different language. And I think, we still see this today. We live in a world that's dominated in the U.S. as particular, with kind of our Anglophone, understandings of things. And obviously, you speaking Spanish, I'm sure there's a lot of stuff that you engage with that, Anglophone Marxists or whatever are like, I don't even know what that shit is. So anyway, I don't know if you had thoughts on this initial piece here.
He sets this up, right, with saying like, look, this is these are the different texts that kind of give us the foundations of Marxism. And you mentioned, though, right, the contribution of critique of political economy, right, Anti-Dühring. And what he argues with Engels is that, that his concept, that the way he wrote about Marx and Marxism became historical convention, he says, right, or a doctrine, That's the language he's using. The way that Engels wrote, the way Engels wrote in Anti-Dühring then becomes a conventional understanding of Marxism and Marx, right? It becomes the doctrine. He uses the phrase, right? But for me, I remember, that a contribution to critique of political economy in 1859. That to me, when I first read that pretty much was my foundation. That was my understanding, especially this one quote, right? And this quote, I have it written in my notebook, an old notebook I have. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. Right? That for me set up the way I think about everything, even to this day, right? And even if someone pushes back on me, I'm still gonna be, nah, that's what it is, right? And I remember being in Cuba and they pushing back on me in Cuba, like, that's a little too deterministic. It's more dialectical than that. And yeah, okay, but that's still for me the foundation that things should be approached with, right? That's the materialist approach, right? But again, here he's getting us to then to think about, right, that, how has that then shaped our understanding of struggle? And then how has that shaped then, how has it limited our understanding of struggle in a way, right? And so then he goes, and to understand that, let's first go back to how Marxism has been, what were the foundations, right? And he's like, well, it's these three different things that people argue, Lenin and Engels argue, right? It's English political economy, French socialism, and German philosophy, right? And when it comes to the English political economy aspect, what he's arguing is, and you mentioned, right, this idea of it's different national cultures. They're all going to have different modes of production. Do they all have different modes of production? But he says at that moment, or if we understand capitalism as Marxists have understood capitalism to be a transnational system, a global system, is there different national modes of production at this moment? If it's a growing international system, economic system, right? So then he's like, if y'all are saying that the social practices that shape ideas, does that mean then that these ideas were shaped by by French society, by English society, by German society, right? And that and how did they all come together to make what we have today, right? But again, Marx, for me, reading that part and reading the critiques that he's having, I don't know. It's I'm still struggling with that idea too, right? Like, as you were saying earlier, right? That he was, when I'm reading this, I'm reading that Marx was bringing all these different bourgeois theorists and then challenging them. Kind of like what Cedric is doing in this book, right? He's reading them all together, synthesizing them, and then building something different, right? But here Cedric's saying, but however, he's building this together, but what are the gaps, or what is the culture that's shaping these ideas? Is that ever discussed? And no, it's not, because it's more about what are the theories that are going to help us move forward. And so again, it wasn't, the argument here, or the development here, is that these were being built to then advance an analysis for revolution, right? And going back to what you're saying earlier, was that how do you move the masses towards revolution, right? And so did Marx have to, and you could say he should have, but he didn't, right, to sit down and analyze the culture of these different societies. I don't think that was the point of his work, right? The point of his work was to advance revolution, right? But here he's saying that, well, there's a seduction of national cultures that we're ignoring, right, from these different places, right? Let me see, what else did I have here?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I also sensed in this for Robinson too was the way that this kind of, lifting up also maybe lent itself to some kind of Euro supremacists, view to some extent, right? Of like that England, Germany, and France were the three most advanced countries in the world at this point, right? And had achieved a certain level of development and civilization, right? That allowed for the elaboration of this thought in this particular way. I mean, I don't disagree that there's some that there's some chauvinism kind of built into that line of thinking. But I also, the question, I guess, for me, and it's one that I think Robinson will deal with some degree, is, okay, well, how does that history, or, you know, how do the conditions that in which these philosophies or political economy or whatever were produced, like, what does that introduce into the theory that could potentially be detrimental to it actually being able to achieve its ends, right? That would be sort of my question.
Yeah, and then, you know, but what he's saying, right, is that a lot of these ideas or theories were already bourgeois, right? There were bourgeois theorists, right, that were the political economists, right, the philosophers from Germany, and the French socialists. They were all middle strata or emerging from the middle strata of society, right? And so that already was influencing how then we would move forward with the theory, yeah. And then Marx and Engels themselves were part of this middle strata as well, right? And he's always been and in most of his work, he's very critical of the intelligentsia, right? How the intelligentsia develops their ideas. Is it for the masses or is it from the masses, right? And so, like, you see that in this work as well, in this discussion here, that's already developing, right? And he's critical of that, right? You know, and I was listening to a recent podcast about someone talking about this, right? That Robinson himself emerges out of this strata, is part of this strata. So it's curious that he's writing about it. And that's the point, right? C.L.R. James was also very critical of this intelligentsia. And, you know, as someone that's in the petty bourgeois of academia, I myself am critical of this position that I hold, right? And so the importance of having that self-reflection or what Marxism called self-criticism, right? Is emerging in this text here, yeah. And so here, let me see. I'm looking at my notes to pull out. You know, because I'm trying to find because he has points for each of them, right? He has like a criticism for each thing, right? So again, the idea of English political economy was it really just English political economy? It should have been actually the capitalist system was not just English, right? But again, if you look at capital, the point of capital, and he says it in the text, right? If you read Marx's Capital, he's studying a closed system. He's looking at the English political economy because he's trying to understand the closed system of capitalism, right? He starts about it; it's a global system, but he's looking at the dynamics of it. But when you're looking at the larger political economy, it's global. When we're looking at German philosophy, this construction of history, right? That there's this idea of a linear approach to history, right? That philosophy was telling us that we start here and one day we'll be here, and that approach, it becomes part of our construction of socialism, right? That there's capitalism, there's feudalism, there's capitalism, there's socialism. One day we'll get to communism, and that there's this linear approach. You know, and again, that's been a huge debate amongst the Marxists, amongst us, right? Do we really take this approach? Is it too deterministic? You know, will we ever reach communism? Or will it be fascism, right? Again, barbarism, right? So there's this that, you know, that what emerges out of the socialist tradition then becomes this idea of a messianic myth, right? That one day we will get there, right? We'll get to this place. And I've heard a conversation all the time in just passing in our movements, right? We are meant to succeed, right? We will get to socialism. Capitalism will get us to socialism eventually, right? And, you know, again, those are the debates that emerge amongst us, right?
And I just had somebody just like a couple of weeks ago, you know, and we discussed it a little bit in the Ali Kadri conversation that we put out the other day, right? Of you reading The Accumulation of Waste, and Kadri does this, I think, really brilliant, you know, theorization that really looks at primitive accumulation as an ongoing process and looks at death and waste making as essential to the capitalist, you know, the way that capitalism not only manages crises, but also produces value. And, you know, we read it all, and there's a person within the group that's like, yeah, but like, where's the we will win? Like, where's the revolutionary, like every revolutionary movement needs, this was what she said, you know, every revolutionary movement needs a belief that not only must we win, but we will win. Yeah. Right. And it's very interesting. I mean, because, you know, this is in some ways the debate around like a Marxism without guarantees, is because the question is, what is the movement value around making it almost, or what is the potential? This is the other side of the argument. Some people would say, well, actually saying that we will win or that it's inevitable, right, could lead us to say, well, we don't need to do anything at all.
Yeah.
Because, and this is something Robinson kind of mentions within the thing, is like this belief that the system just produces its own contradictions, which will eventually lead to a revolution, right? Which is present within, like the Communist Manifesto or other texts in certain places, right? But it is something that I think both Marx and Engels corrected and others did later on, and say like, no, actually, like we do have to do shit. Like we do actually have to struggle. Like we can't just sit, on our laurels and think that it is, that we have to win. But saying that we will win also gives people the strength of like, like we're gonna fight, we're gonna win, we must win, we have to win, and so it's an important kind of, go ahead.
No, and it's important, right? Because again, whoever that person was, it's that part of that, they're probably part of an organization, or they're part of organizing. Because it's like, if you're just most academics get stuck with the pessimism. We just so overly critical. There's no hope. This is what it is, right? We just need the end of the world. No, we don't need the end of the world. We need struggle. And it goes back to that very famous quote of Gramsci, right? Pessimism, intellect, optimism of will, right? And so I think going back to what you were saying earlier with how these texts are written, right? Communist Manifesto is a rallying cry. It's a manifesto, right? So it's like the promised land is over there if you struggle, right? And that's what he's saying, that German philosophy is tied to the Christian development of history, right? Where like there will be a promised land when you and so that he says, thus in the West, religious expectations and prophecy became the template of history, right? This construction of, right, this Messianic myth, where on page 7, right? So socialist society, a social order which displays no classes, no class struggle, and therefore no history, reflects a kind of apocalyptic messianism, right? This construct, I would say it's communism, not socialist society, but communist society, right? But again, I know what he means. But so this construction of history that emerges out of German philosophy. And when it comes to French socialism, right, again, building off of the French Revolution, specifically the Jacobin Revolt of 1792 to 94, right? The construction of communist and utopian thinkers developing an alternative view, a critique of capitalism, right? Saint Simon, right, and his Fourier, that all these dudes had these approaches to understanding revolution, right? And on page 11, he has, quote, what Marx and Engels achieved then was not the invention of socialist theory, but the formulation of a historical system which put the critique nurturing the political movement on empirical grounding, some of which were spurious, right? And so what emerges out of Marx and Engels is, again, this empirical analysis of how you build socialism versus just the idea of it, which I think for a lot of us is useful. This idea of that scientific approach, this is right that he's critiquing, but I think for a lot of us still hold very dear to us, right? That there needs to be a scientific and empirical, concrete analysis of what's around us, right? What's up against us? Who's the enemy? Who's the friend, right? And how to build that, right? And I think for me, again, that's not something I still hold, and there's a question in the chat about the scientific aspect. Should we get rid of it? Don't get rid of it, but how do we build it, right? And so, so that's that part that he has that critiques of these three different approaches, right?
Yeah. Of the three, the one I found, the French socialism section I found interesting just because he's pointing to these other figures, Saint Simon and others that, that basically develop a lot of these tools that then, basically Marx and Engels kind of put together into a kind of system, right? And put it again on these empirical grounds. I agree with you. I was bothered by, and this is always the little things that Robinson do that kind of like, like it's like he's flicking me or something like that. Like it's just like, why do you do that? Like some of those empirical grounds were spurious, right? Like he has to always put these little lines in to basically say like, they're doing this, but some of it is bullshit. And I think for me, part of what I would say to that, right, is it totally depends upon you know, how do you define science? What do you think about as a scientific tool? You know, I mean, some of the grounds of anthropology are spurious, right? Like, you know, this is how I
Yeah.
would sort of respond. Some of the grounds
Yeah.
of math or of
Yeah.
science or,
Yeah.
you know, that any of these things, they're full of periods where if you go back to them, people thought things and wrote all kinds of shit about stuff that just wasn't true. And we don't go back to that. When we were talking the other day, I used the example of Isaac Newton, right? I think Benji might have brought this up in a conversation I had with him last week of, you know, you don't, if Newton had racist thoughts or was wrong on certain things, you don't go back and say, well, that gravity thing or those laws of physics, like they sure were wrong, right? Like we can't, it's like, no, like science is a developing thing,
Yeah.
right? And so what Marx and Engels or Lenin thought that was incorrect at a certain point, we should be able to recognize that and say, okay, well, we're not going to bother to try to just do these exact things the exact same way because it won't work in our conditions, or they were incorrect in their assessment of this piece of it. But it doesn't mean, in my view, that you have to say, okay, all of these tools of analysis and motivation and struggle and organization are all things that we then, you know, discard because there are incorrect ideas that exist here. There's always going to
Yeah.
be incorrect ideas, you know.
Yeah.
um
Yeah. And
so
that's,
you know that,
yeah.
yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go on.
The other thing, just quickly, is the German idealism or philosophy section I found really interesting, because I think that he's absolutely right here. I mean, the point about the messianism, about the notion of Christianity's influence, you know, China Mieville talks about this within his book on the Communist Manifesto, and, you know, the way that Marx and Engels were very influenced by Christian socialists, and the whole pamphlet culture in Europe in the time was these kind of like religious manifestos and things like this, right? And the Communist Manifesto in form actually is following that in a lot of ways. And so their deliverance of these, you know, ideas of inevitability and of, you know, communism as this, you know, classless society that's, you know, kind of this utopian vision, um, you know, that there are these elements of messianism and the good news, right, that comes with a certain Christian belief system and so on. And as Robinson notes, it's also there within Judaism. And I think that that's really important to kind of name. And I think it'll be interesting because I know one of the critiques or one of the topics within this book, which does relate to the socialism, scientific or utopian question, is, you know, what do we do about religion? What do we do about spirituality? How does this relate if we're looking towards similar goals, right? And I think this is something that um, is a very good question, especially because we see nowadays people that, you know, say, well, I don't support the axis of resistance, or I don't support Iran or whatever, because like they believe, you know, different, you know, this is a theological society, or their views are based upon, you know, Islam, and that's not Marxism, right? Or something like that,
Yeah.
right? And, you know, I think that this is a very wrong way to do politics and internationalism. We'll probably address it more as
That's
we
right.
go through.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you know, it is something that is embedded in some ways within some of the critiques of Marxism, because of that primacy of this kind of secular, you know, tradition, and the fact that a lot of these movements were coming up against the church, right? And needed to also see the church as something that they had to struggle against in their society, you know.
Yeah, and that, you know, and that's what and again, that's what we're getting into it, that this book is going beyond the utopian thinkers, right? Remember that. So like in Marx, in the Communist Manifesto, he's critiquing the utopian thinkers of Saint Simon and Fourier, right? Cedric, this book is going like far. Let's go farther back to than these dudes, than the utopian thinkers. We're gonna go back all the way to the critiques of those dudes that are critiquing the church, and their socialist impulse, right? So that's what's also really important for me in this book, that it's going farther back, right? Until I think what the 17th century, or I think the 16th, right? It's going way back into those different socialist impulses. And I mentioned to you, I think it's a good book to read alongside Caliban and the Witch, Silvio Federici's book. If you read these two books together, the construction of, you were mentioning Ali Kadri, primitive accumulation, right? So we're constantly developing our Marxist lens, right? So like the idea that at one moment people thought primitive accumulation was the past, and now it's a very common thing to be. It's an ongoing thing, right? This is an ongoing, primitive accumulation is ongoing. It's not something just happened in the past. But for us, it was that's how the analysis was at one moment. It was something that started capitalism, and that's it. It's like, nah, dude, this is an ongoing thing, right? That we've learned from different scholars, right? Different Marxist scholars on the ground about this. And so this point about building off of that, then, I think the questions of German, French socialism. Let me see what else was going to say here. No, I can move on. Yeah, we'll move on. Next point.
Yeah.
So national culture, historical materialism, and national culture.
Yep. Hang on, I'm just looking at one other thing here. Yeah, no, we can move into that. Yeah. So yeah, is this section on historical materialism and national culture. And again, this kind of comes back to that point that was raised earlier about this, lifting up as, again, those three categories of English political economy, which the point that Robinson largely makes, as you've pointed out, is like, well, there were political economists from different countries, and that part of what allowed capital to happen for Marx was like that he could synthesize or look at work that demonstrated the global, that capitalism was a global system, already. Mm-hmm. And then, the other national categories, of course, the German philosophy, French socialism.
Well, and it goes back, like you're saying earlier, right, that what he's arguing is that these dudes were influenced by like the dominant ideas of the times, right? And so like these were the dominant, but what existed, or what could they have been looking at differently, or how would their approach have been shaped differently if they were looking at different regions, right, or different understandings of the economy from different perspectives, rather than just the bourgeois theorists, right? But these were the dominant views. Yeah. But again, it goes back to the point. The book Capital is called a critique of political economy, right? So it's not like they were just building off of it. This is what it is. They were actually critiquing these bourgeois theorists, right? Right. They were critiquing the French, the German idealists, and the English political economists. They weren't necessarily using them as is, right? But that's what he argues too, though, that a lot of the ideas that they do use as is, right? So that's kind of like the part that he's trying to push us to think about. Are they really critiquing them, or are they building off of them and not necessarily like radically moving away from them?
Right? Yeah. I mean, I think Robinson recognizes that in certain ways, for sure, that Marx and Engels are, that they turn these things on their head, right? And that they are critiquing the, the bourgeois theorists and, the capitalist system and all of this. I think what is interesting to Robinson is to look at the areas where he feels like they retain basically the mystifications of the bourgeoisie within their work, right? So it's like you think you're critiquing everything. And I mean, I think this should seem obvious to us, right? Like we exist within a society and we think that we're critiquing everything in it, but yet there are elements of that society that we're not even conscious that we're reproducing, right? And I don't think it could be any other way in some extent, but it is interesting because, of course, Robinson is looking at it from a further remove, so he has a different vantage point than they do,
Yeah, and and I go, for me, it's like when you think of the dialectical materialism, right? The method of understanding is that things are constantly changing. Right? That's for me, like that's like a constant idea. Like the only truth is change, right? That things are constantly in flux. And so when you're looking at these dudes studying these different theorists from these different places, Cedric is really interested in pushing us to think about how these different colonial places, because there were obviously these European countries or European nations developing at the time, already had this racial interpretation of nationhoods, right? They were already developing their own understanding of themselves as nations, as subjects of the state, of that state. For him, then, is like, well, then how does that then shape the outlook of Marxism, right? How does that then shape like you were saying earlier, the national chauvinism that might emerge of our interpretation of analysis, right? And so, in that sense, if we're not taking into consideration that reality, it's actually obscuring the historical and cultural materials that shape it.
Yeah.
Now, for
yeah,
me,
so
though,
let me just read one quote from him, and then it would probably respond to it, because he says, "What is issue here is not the disfigurement of Marxism by some simplistic cultural geometry, but the whole enterprise undertaken by generations of Marxists, which amounts to the foreshortening of socialist thought, the proprietary impulse which appropriates true or scientific socialism to Marxism. In short, the insistence that socialism and Marxism constitute an identity. Socialist thought did not begin with or depend on the existence of capitalism, as Marx, Engels, Kautsky, and later Marxists have dictated, but historical materialism demanded that for a socialist mode of production, capitalism had to be prior." I mean, we can bracket that because that's debatable. Thus, any expression of socialist principles prior to the maturation of the capitalist system was primitive or utopian. As Kautsky commented on his study of Thomas More, he was the father of utopian socialism, which was rightly named after his utopia. The latter is utopian less on account of the impracticability of its aims than on the inadequacy of the means at its disposal for their achievement. That quote is from Kautsky. And then he's going to deal with Kautsky more in a later chapter, which I look forward to checking out. But that one point just within that, historical materialism demanded for a socialistic mode of production, capitalism had to be prior. I mean, this again is one of those things that at a certain stage is doctrinal for a lot of Marxists. However, there have been a lot of disagreements with this historically. Marx himself, looked at Russian peasant, communes and said, well, perhaps they don't need to actually proceed into capitalism. Maybe they can move right into a socialist mode of production. And, on and on. I mean, I look at like the work of Chris Gilbert around the communes in Venezuela as like a really interesting work around, this respect. But there is the whole question, which I think is an important one, around the development of the productive forces, whether you can feed the whole society with, the system of agriculture that you have, whether you can meet the basic needs and develop in certain ways. And I think if we look in the current context of imperialism, whether you can defend your project against the United States or the Zionist entity or on, right? And so the question of development to me is not just kind of or of the stages. It's not, to me, it's less about the stages, right? And it's a question of like what's necessary actually to provide for people and to defend what you're doing.
Definitely. And I think about those debates happening in China. The Cultural Revolution was a big part of that reason, right? That the productive forces or the relations of production. What are we focusing on, right? And that was a debate between China and Russia and Soviet Union in that moment, right? The split that happened. At this section for me too is this important part. What he's trying to push us to think about, the insisting that socialism and Marxism constitute an identity, right? I think that's really what he's stuck on. He's trying to disentangle the idea of socialism from Marxism and saying that these two things don't have to be the same, right? You can have a socialism develop before Marx, and that's what he's saying. Socialism developed before. But again, for a lot of us that come into this, it's through Marx. It's through Marxism that we come to this, to socialism. I'm the one of them, right? And so it's kind of hard to read that and be like, well, I don't know. Like that's always been how I understood it, right? And so when I read this and then be like, look, here's the examples of other moments that were socialistic, right? Uh, can we read that then in other places that doesn't necessarily had to have read Marx? And so then for me, that's also a good organizational tool, right? Because it's like some people already, because of the Cold War, because of the anti-communism, you hear the word Marx and you don't want to even deal with. You need fucking healthcare, bro. You need a better wage. You need living standards that are better than what you have now. You don't gotta say, I don't gotta say Marx at that point. I could just, so like these ideas, these impulses, the socialist impulse, what he says, right, is there. How do we build that? And for some people, well, you have to uphold Marx. You have to put him forward. And for others, like, no, you could do it other ways, right? And so when me reading this and reading it as through that lens of like, how do I use this as a tool to then build, and not just use it as a tool to just critique Marxism, be like, okay, we're done with Marxism, but how do we then think, well, how do we build a socialist society or socialist organizing, and not scare the masses away from it because they've been told to be scared of it all this time, right? But another part that was important here. Oh man, I should have wrote it down as I was listening to you say talk, and I was like, oh, this is a good point. Oh yeah. When the Russian Revolution happened in 1917, Gramsci wrote a piece called "The Revolution Against Capital." And what was he saying in that piece? He was like, dude, this revolution actually went against the ideas that Marx was talking about in Capital, because you have to build the forces to even have a revolution. And actually, Russia shows you an example of that. So like you said, there's already been different folks already saying this, critiquing this idea, right? That the revolution doesn't have to go through this stage, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's the whole like strongest link in the chain versus weakest link in the chain, discussion. And, but I will say that even in the countries, when you have countries who have revolutions that are the poorer countries, they also then face their own challenges of, okay, how do we develop if we still need a lot of development where we are in order to be able to get people schools and hospitals and housing and, trains and infrastructure and things like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we then have to go to the capitalists to do trade or whatever, so there's a lot of different challenges to that. But I do think historically it is kind of borne out, and I feel like it's accepted by a lot of people, although probably not Western Marxists or folks that are like really antagonistic to anti-colonial struggle and things like this. But England, France, Germany, like they never have their revolution, right? They never have anything that brings about a socialist society, and they do get bogged down in a lot of the stuff Lenin talks about in terms of like kind of, democratic politics that require some sort of alliances with, their bourgeois parties and things like this that, and so, yeah, I think that's an important thing to deal with and to reckon with of, the United States too, Canada, right? These places don't have socialist revolutions and haven't. And it's not to say that it's impossible, but we need to also reckon with why hasn't that happened? And, what are the conditions that are have made that so difficult, historically speaking, when if you just read Marx, you might think, oh, well, those are the places where it will happen. It'll happen there first,
Yeah. And again, like you're saying, it hasn't, right? And there's a lot of different things, right? The role of the capitalist state with anti-communism, right? He would argue the weakness of our own organizations, right? That our own organizations have been weak in developing an alternative, right? And is it because of our dogmatic reading of Marxism, right? Has it been the racialisms that shape our organizations? Because he mentions that too, right? That because of this framing of the proletariat as the center of revolutionary struggle, all these other forms of workers have to subsume themselves to their organizations, whether that be the unions, the trade organizations, which Lenin had a critique of them, right? But saying that these organizations oftentimes tend to be conservative and reactionary to revolutionary change, right? And so then, but specifically in the in the global north, right? As the places that you just mentioned, that they've been conservative organs. Right?
Yeah, right. That's part of the thing, right, that he brings up here, right, is this question of, this idea that, yeah, you have to organize this industrial proletariat. And Robin says, well, that's often quite conservative, actually. And it's, which is true in many cases. But I think that's also like part of what has to be discussed there is the reason why Marx and Engels focused on the industrial proletariat. It wasn't because they were so radical and potentially it was because where they were seated objectively within the system.
Exactly.
I mean, they did think that the shop floor would be this place that could bring them together and all of that, which, we could talk about why that hasn't necessarily been the case so much. But it wasn't because there was something that was subjectively radical about them in that moment where they thought, hey, this is where all the radical energy is among these workers. It was because they're prime positioned to strike, right? And to actually, bring that capitalist system to a halt and then democratize what's going on, the economy essentially, right?
That's the theory, right? That's the view, that the approach, right? And again, when you look at different organizations in the global south, that's still the approach, right? When you look at the Philippines, look at different type of workers that try to organize in the Philippines, are union based, right? There's radical unions in the Philippines that are organizing workers through that lens, right? In Latin America, there's similar thing, right? But they are oftentimes tied to a larger organization. It's not just, and that's when it becomes revolutionary, when they're tied to a party or something, not just a random, just like, a faculty union. I mean, that's not tied to something broader, right? It's more about getting social democratic gains rather than actually revolutionary change.
Right.
But then,
yeah, that's
that.
Okay.
That's no, but that's the part that then becomes conservative, right? Because you're trying to conserve your own existence rather than transform it, right?
Right.
And so
it's that difference between trade union consciousness and revolutionary consciousness that Joshua Mufwad Paul talks about.
Exactly. Yeah, right. So again, this idea of that this approach, and he said he does this in Black Marxism, right? That focusing on that is the erasure of other workers and people, slaves, serfs, peasants, right? Women at that moment, right, were erased. But again, Marxist approaches have picked up these different analysis, right? The role of slaves, the role of serfs, the role of peasants, the role of revolutionary women throughout different movements, right? Going back to what you just Cherry's Burden Studies and Black communist women, so Federici looking back at the feudal era, right? You have these different moments of arguments, right? So again, this book, he says that instead of looking at Marx and Marxism at that moment, or the utopian thinkers of the French Revolution and the utopian socialism, he's going to go back to the masses in the Middle Ages, right? And that this book is going to look at during that era, there emerged a bunch of rebels and ideologists, men and women, who made a history of socialism that oftentimes is not remembered or thought of, right? Because our history of what we think of as Marxism is Marxism in the era of Marx responding to the utopian socialists, and that's the French Revolution forward. And he's saying, well, let's go back farther. Let's go back to the Middle Ages. And that's his big thing with even in Black Marxism, right? Let's look at the feudal era and how that shapes our understanding of race and capitalism, right? And so the focus of this book then, right, is that the socialist discourse in the West, which preceded Marxism, right? And some main points again, I guess the critique of hagiography, as we mentioned, that we need to critique how we've created this identity between Marxism and socialism. Rather than the idea of one person or a German intellectuals or legendary collaboration, socialist ideal was embedded in Western civilization at its progenic cultures, right? So again, looking at the culture of resistance in Europe. Again, this idea that, because for what you mentioned earlier, right, that people read Cedric as just anti-white or just doesn't like Europe or something like that. But here he's showing, no, actually, look, if you look at Western Europe, there is a radical impulse to its own existence, right? Marxian socialism is an attempt to provide a secular format with a distinctive historical stratigraphy, right? So again, that Marxian socialism was a way of making a secular approach to socialism, and just critiquing again, just how a lot of us just focus on scientific socialism rather than different other forms of socialism. Right? And he ends with this one paragraph or quote on page 17, right? My objective, however, is not simply to critique the self-serving historical practices of Marxism or renounce Marxist conceits. Rather, it is to suggest that since it can be demonstrated that Marxian socialism was not the first expression of socialism, it is probable that it will not be the last. So again, it's not necessarily just to renounce Marxist conceits, but it's like to be critical of like that there's socialisms could be different forms of socialism. Right? And I wonder, how people talk about like China with socialist characteristics, or not socialism with Chinese characteristics, or Cuban socialism. And some people say all that stuff it's just socialism. It shouldn't be Cuban socialism or Chinese socialism. It's just socialism. But when you're down in those cultures, there's something like when I go to Cuba, there's something different there. Like there is something of different approach that was influenced not just by Marx, it was influenced by Jose Marti, by Antonio Maceo, right? Like there's a Fidel, right? There's like a different approach that has to be understood at the context of that place, right? We just can't be it's a universal. There's universal principles, but how is it then concrete at that moment at that place, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's why, and I'll be interested to see if he kind of delves into this deeper. I'm not as, what's funny, and I mentioned this to you before, is people call Robinson a cultural nationalist, but I think he has more smoke for nationalism really than he even has for Marxism, really. And I mean, I get that category of cultural nationalist can mean a lot of things to folks, and it's kind of like you're either this or that, right? But I think that to the point that you were talking about Cuba, or Venezuela, right, or China and so on, I think it's wrong to dismiss like national culture just because culture is also a very complicated thing that includes elements from all kinds of different places, right? It's still there's still things that are created within specific contexts, right, that do influence the development of certain things, right? And that's why even that discussion of like English political economy, German philosophy, French socialism, it doesn't bother me quite as much as Robinson seems focused on it in this chapter, because I mean, I understand the point of why he is, but I think for Engels and Lenin, they probably were thinking, look, there are certain things about the development of these traditions within these areas that brought forth certain ideas that then were synthesized in this system, Yeah. All right. So the next section is on, it's the beginning of chapter 2.
Yeah.
So the social origins of materialism and socialism. It starts with a guide quote from Norman Cohn, who says, more than any other religion, Jewish religion centers on the expectation of a future golden age. Christianity inherited that expectation. So I know we'll have another question about messianism. I saw Darren in the chat with some stuff around that. But I think this is what, Robinson is kind of alluding to in terms of that connection. And yeah, I mean, he gets into here the social origins of materialism and socialism, obviously. The first section is on materialism. Is there anything you wanted to say about this section kind of opening up?
I was trying to like, okay, so, then help me out with this. Because again, he mentions these three, right? The three origins, the origin story of Marxism. But then he's like, I'm going to talk about that there's things missing, two things missing. It's one, materialism and socialism, or French social, but specifically materialism, right? But I always thought that was already embedded in it, right? I don't understand why go into detail about materialism when it was already there. In my understanding, for example, when I learned Marxism, that was the main point, materialism, right? But here he's like, well, let's go deeper into discuss it, right?
I mean, I think that he wanted to, again, it's like part of this going back,
Yeah.
right? And so with materialism, he goes all the way back to like what, 6th century Greece or
6th
something
century
like
Greece.
this,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Greek thought. Hmm.
And so in part, I think he's looking, um, at how, I mean, one, he mentions, as we review the extraordinary events of the 18th and 19th centuries, the social revolutions which overturned the traditional orders of Western Europeans, we discovered that classical materialism, the modern variant which prioritized the objective world, had sprung from the attack on Christianity and the political
Yeah.
order
That's right.
absolutism it had come to authorize, right? And so in part, what he's getting at, I think, is that the materialism in Europe sprung up in response to the church and the church's
Church.
authorization of kings, basically
Exactly. Yeah.
monarchical authority,
Yeah.
as being sanctioned by God, and as then sort of sanctioning people to a certain lot, right, within the feudal order or whatever. Like, you're supposed to be there. This is what God wills, kind of thing.
Hmm.
And materialism, even in its kind of classical forms or earlier forms, gave a way to critique these things of saying, the ideas, right, that are being promoted are promoted based on the social arrangement, basically, right?
Yeah.
And so it is our condition that we are struggling against, and those people are saying we should be in our condition because
Yeah.
it suits them, kind of
Yeah.
ideologically. And so that's kind of, I think he wanted to sort of go much further back within European history and just say this has a long history within responses to the church, which I think will come up more as we get into the other, the other experiments in socialism and
Yeah.
struggles of socialism and so on.
Yeah. Because I remember, I remember a mentor of mine when I first started, studying this stuff and trying to understand it. He's like, there's a debate that there's always going to exist around when you're dealing with these things, is the debate between idealism and materialism. He's like, and it's going to be there. And whatever you do, whatever you write, however you think, there's always going to be this back and forth between these two, right? And I remember being in Cuba and then being like, well, it's dialectical. It's not one or the other. They shape how we understand both the world, right? But I go back to like reading this. I just think of the thesis of Feuerbach and Marx's critique of right, that he sets it up, how his materialism is going to be different from the classical materialism, right? And Cedric is going, well, those two kind of like what you're saying earlier. Let's go farther back than those two materialisms, right? Those two materialisms, the classical of Feuerbach and the idea that I have it written down right here. What is it? It was classical material was very mechanical, that there's no change, right? And then Marx brings the dialectical materialism, that there's constant change, right?
It's also that the classical materialism, his point is that it suits the bourgeoisie.
Yeah.
Because it's like the classical materialism was like, all these stupid kings and the church, like they shouldn't be running everything. We're the people who run the businesses, run the agriculture, run the shops. We should benefit from the system. So, and then he makes the point that Marx and Engels, of course, wanted to deepen that and say, no, it shouldn't just be this strata, which they were a part of, right? That benefits from this. It should actually be, much more democratic than that, and the workers should be a part of it,
Yeah, and so then, in that he brings the discussion of the contribution of critique of political economy, this idea of the base and superstructure, right? This construction of Marx's idea of the base and superstructure. I had it written down, right? Classical materialism equals displacement of the nobility by the capitalist, right? Historical materialism, displacement of the capitalist by the proletariat, right? Right. So the focus of this, right? So the push political economy to a critique of commercial property. So Marx added that. He added that the classical materialists, like you said, were just developing political economy. They were like, the kings and nobility don't know how to run an economy. They're greedy. Right. They're tied to the divine, supposedly. But historical materialism was a critique of that, of a critique of commercial property, right? Of the development of private property, right? So, but Marx added the dialectical analysis to materialism. So there's materialism, but there's dialectical materialism.
Yeah. The only other thing that I noted on this section, and then we can jump into probably questions from the chat because this is the last section that we read from this, but was just the focus or the mention, right, that materialism doesn't explain everything, which is, again, like typical of Robinson, right? Robinson is interested in, systems of thought,
Yeah.
cosmologies. It comes up in, his focus on like ontological totality and all of this stuff within Black Marxism. The other things that, led, enslaved people to revolt and all of that. And I always struggle with that part of Black Marxism too, because I'm also like, yeah, but they were also struggling against their material conditions, right? They were struggling against being enslaved, and so the, but I think Robinson's point, and it's an important point, and it's important for all people who struggle, right? Was sort of like, yeah, but what motivates them or what they
Mhm.
use to
Yeah.
strengthen themselves in that struggle, they may be ideas, they may be mystical ideas, they may be spiritual ideas, and so on. And I mean, we still see that. Like, there's, so many, again, we could talk about the axis of resistance or anything else, but so many
Yeah.
movements are strengthened by some belief in, a god or, a spiritual system or so on, that they think they need that with them for the fight,
Yeah.
basically. And,
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, I think about like Robin Kelly's Hammer and Hoe, right? It talks about like they weren't reading the Communist Manifesto, they were reading the Bible, right? Through that lens, right? Through the lens of Marx class struggle, right? Same thing with liberation theologians, theologians in Latin America, right? They were creating their Christian communal bases and using the word of the Lord to organize peasants, right? Um, I so for tying that sense to and then the point he says, like, I'm gonna go like now that we're thinking about this, I go back to that. He wants to look at the origins of materialism and socialist discourse. He goes far back because he wants to show that it's also the ideological formations that challenge the Christianity and the Roman Church, right? That the as you were saying earlier, right, that the basis of this materialism was a challenge of the church, and he's going to give us that history in the next chapters, right? That he's going to show how the development of a socialist discourse was in opposition to the Roman Catholic Church, right, and Christianity at that time. But then at the same
right
time,
on.
how the church then pulls in those ideas, right?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So
Yeah, so let's look at some of the things that people brought up in the chat. So first question that we have here. Shout out to Poncho McFarlane. Why did he choose 3 men as the Black Marxist representatives in Black Marxism and no women? And I mean, this is something that's talked about a lot. I mean, he actually has critiqued himself,
yeah, yes,
his lack of emphasis on, like Claudia Jones or like,
mm-hmm.
communist women, black feminist women in communist
Yeah,
parties and so on. And I think he just sort of has acknowledged that in some ways that was a blind spot for him, and that he sees, so, towards the very end of his life, he saw more the importance of, that work and studying those intellectuals and things as well. But there's also the, no, go ahead.
no, HLT Kwan has a really good essay on talking about Black Marxism and that approach, the methodology that he uses, right? That the focus is it's people's history, but yeah, it's the focus of these 3 men, and he critiques that, but it's more the people's history that from below that he writes about that emerges out of that book, not just the focus of these 3 men. Yeah, and then you see that
Yeah.
his later book, is it Black Movements in America? I think it's a lot of focus on organizing communities and different people in the community.
Yeah, and I mean, I always took the choice of those 3 men and the way that he frames it in that section of that book to be a bit polemical. Not, I mean, there's a different critiques of it. Like, some are like, well, why didn't he include, you know, um, Fanon, or why doesn't he talk about the fact that Du Bois ended his life as a communist, right? He makes it seem like he leaves the tradition and doesn't come back, and, this kind of thing. But I think that what we can say about it is that Robinson was trying to make a certain point about the experiences of these Black communists with these different communist organizations, and the different things that did drive them out at certain points, or did cause them to kind of run up against a lot of disagreement and criticism with their comrades, right? As particularly their white comrades, or particular points. And so I think there's a way that people can read that as a dismissal of Marxism, and there are certainly certain ways that, as I mentioned earlier, like when he says this is on spurious grounds, I mean, he has a lot of those little individual like polemical lines in there that I'm like, this is not actually helpful to what you're arguing here, in my view. But I do think that what he's pointing to are many authentic experiences of, Black communists and Black radicals confronting Western communists, and some of these presuppositions that he's been talking about in this piece of, who represents a worker, what is the role of Black people within this struggle if they're not the industrial proletariat, and on, right? And so all right. Other things.
It's like Gerald Horne always talks about our friends on the left. Like this, the criticism that we have to have of our organizing. Right?
The point, many Marxist organizations leave out rural workers and indigenous. It's true, and there's also examples to the contrary to that, for sure.
Exactly. I talk about the organizing in the Philippines. It's a lot of focusing on the peasantry. Like, how do you organize the peasantry, right? And then there's not America. There's also organizations that have done that. But again, if you read Wretched of the Earth, right? Fanon was critical of that, right? Of the organizing that happened in the urban area and abandoning the agrarian question.
I'd be curious to hear you all discuss the word science, which Robinson places in square quotes on page 1 at some point. Curious, do we need to hold on to or insist on a scientific socialism? So, I mean, I think in one sense, this is something we will probably talk about quite a bit as we go through this book, because I think to some extent Robinson is trying to argue against the idea of scientific socialism, whereas we probably will be wanting to argue for it.
Yeah. Well, what I would say about that is like, he's arguing that, again, there's been different forms of socialism, and that the dominant one, which is which we've had come to see called scientific socialism, needs to be questioned should it be why does it have to be the dominant one? But I would argue, like, if we look at all the movements in the global South that have had a revolution, most of them have used the scientific socialist approach, right? Or have argued for it, right? And and you could push back on that and be like, well, and is it that why they failed, or is that the way they haven't succeeded? And that could be the gaps that Cedric is trying for us to think about, right? And there's also fucking imperial conquest, imperial fucking plunder that hasn't allowed them to succeed. I mean, let's be real here, right? Sanctions don't allow for revolutions to be redeveloped, right? But again, the scientific socialist approach, for me, it's still a generative and an important way of studying it. I think is important for us, right? Those of us that believe in study, I think scientific socialism is still something that should be studied seriously.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what's at stake, right, is, I mean, there's versions of scientific socialism which can be very deterministic, can be very, there are these laws of, human history and social change that have to be followed rigidly, and on and on. And then there are versions of it, when I had the conversation with Dani Manibat about his piece on social investigation, class analysis, and material, he talked about that, we really are talking about a much, like, not, that he was like, I understand and agree with the critiques of, like, Western science, right? Or of what we think of, we're talking about a kind of a science of struggle, right? In a way experimentation, but also not just experimentation, like let's do a million different, let's go out and do whatever and then see what happens.
Yeah.
Right. But like, let's look at what has, the struggles that have worked, how people adapted these approaches to their different conditions, and see, what we can do with that ourselves, and to do that collectively, as
Yeah.
an organization or a party, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that aspect of social investigation, class analysis, is the part of scientific socialism that we need, right? That we study social conditions and social analysis and study other histories, right? So I think the scientific socialism is still something that for me still holds important weight, right? That we should still study it and analyze it. And again, I go back to this point, right? That reading Cedric shouldn't reading Cedric Robinson's work should not encourage you not to read, disencourage you, or dissuade you from reading Marxism, right? It's on the contrary. You should be reading it to understand why he's even critiquing it, right? I think the problem is that folks read him and then be like, well, I don't got to read Marxism because he already critiqued it for me, right? And it's like, well, then you're missing the point, because George Jackson was reading Marxism. The Black Panther Party was reading Marxism. Walter Rodney was reading Marxism. Claudia Jones was reading Marxism. I could just keep on going. All these folks that we highlight that were reading Marxism, right? They weren't reading an academic postmodern text, they were reading Marxism, right? So, yeah,
and they were reading it in parties and making, putting forth their, like, those articles that you love. A lot of times are published in communist newspapers or whatever else, right? And they're making that kind of argument among their comrades, right? I mean, I think the one thing I would say, which I agree with too, is he talks about in there this kind of proprietary impulse, right? Of people who are part of the scientific socialist tradition saying, yeah, this is scientific socialism, this is Marxism, it's ours, it belongs to us, and it's an example of what we did, whether or not we stood with it when they were trying to do what they were doing or not, all those kind of things. I do think that this is a problem, and I think that part of the issue that Robinson's pointing to, which is important, is that if we're really taking a kind of scientific socialist approach, we should be studying all kinds of struggles, and it shouldn't matter to us whether those struggles have a red banner, right, or call themselves communists, right? Again, this can be the bad impulse that then leads people against certain types of solidarities, because say, well, that nation state and the people there, or that movement, they're not actually a communist movement. And it's like, yeah, but they're confronting imperialism, right? And so, but we can talk about that more as it goes on, because I think that's part of what Robinson's pointing on.
Yeah, that's right on. And I think that's the part that the preparatory impulse is what's important to really self-critique, in ourselves. I think in our approach, our analysis. I think that's that's why I felt his work has always been helpful for me, as someone that believes in the Marxist approach, someone that believes that waves the red banner, right? That, okay, well, what are the blind spots that I might have, right? What am I missing in this approach, right? Or when I'm understanding a certain situation, right? Or relations of forces, what am I missing here, right? Because again, he's not only questions Marx, heavily critical of nationalism, as you said, of liberalism, right? And so how are these things in shape our analysis? I think that's fundamental right there. That's a key point. Again, the current moment with what's happening in Gaza, right, in Palestine, and the different axes of resistance that you mentioned.
Yeah. I love the idea of the investigation of socialism not as something that springs from the minds just of Marx and Engels, but as a continuation of a lineage of thought. That was great to read. Yeah, absolutely. It's important that we not think of these people as, because again, that's the whole putting them on pedestal and thinking that like they are like Moses and they brought us the tablets. Like that's not what it is,
Yeah, and I think that's, for me, that's the most important, one of the contributions of this, right? But I think others have done that too, right? I'm not saying that he's the only one that's done that. Others have said that as well. But I think we could get caught up, We get caught up, again, I admit it. You know, like I'm one of them. You know, I'm not gonna say I'm not. You know, like I think most of us that
I
believe in
mean,
this. You know, like
yeah,
yeah,
and I
yeah,
also would say like I'm not one of those people. I mean, you see all the books behind me. Like
yeah, yeah.
I'm not one of those people that says like, okay, well these guys are just like everybody else either, right? Like, or
Yeah,
that they're
yeah.
just like, no, like just read the work. It's good.
Yeah,
Like,
read the work. Read the work. Yeah, I think
um,
and it goes back to I think I read this, and we talked about it, right? It's using Mao's conceptions, right? It's a non-antagonistic contradiction. That's how I'm reading this. It's not an antagonistic contradiction. It's not antagonistic, right? And it builds our understanding.
yeah. So, other comments. It's this was against the Newtonian. Yes, shout out to Benji. Why it's important to call it historical dialectical materialism and not Marxism.
Yeah,
Yeah, some people will say communism, right?
yeah,
Because physics is not Newtonism after all, right?
yeah,
And I think that is an issue that we deal with a little bit. Is that the term that we use most often does kind of place it as like, this is the word of Marx, right?
yeah.
One that we didn't fully delve into this. You're right, Pancho. This is a good important point. Is
Yeah.
Robinson also is always interested in these conversations around time and around history, and that many people's conceptions of history don't conform to what became this Western conception of an extremely long past, a short future, right? And then a long future, or short present and a long future. And this kind of, big events that happen and the importance of the past and all of this, that a lot of it fit more to the cycles that people had within their lives, whether that be the cycles of, the sun or the seasons and things like this, right? Agricultural cycles of migration, like all of these kind of things. And I mean, I think that's an important point. The point that he's making primarily to bring that up in this instance is to deal with the way that Christianity structured our understanding of time, right? We literally do the BC AD thing, right? We do the, and so there's all of that, and there's prophecy and all that kind of thing. And so how do those conceptions infuse themselves into the Western tradition more broadly, and then into Marxism? Yeah.
And so exactly, right. And the bourgeois history of the great man history, right? This construction of like that there's great men in history that have shaped our history rather than a history of struggle, of class. But it goes back to do you think that in Marxist analysis or socialist analysis, this idea that history is shaped by class struggle, is that the same thing as this linear history? Is it, or
Sorry, say that again. I was reading something in the chat. My bad.
I was saying like the construction of that history has been shaped by class struggle. Is that also a construction of a linear history, right? Or is it dialectical? Where if it's class struggle, it doesn't really tell us. Yes, there could be that deterministic analysis that one day we'll get to socialism. But if you come from the approach that is dialectical and there's a history of class struggle, we don't know where it's going to take us because this is a class struggle.
Yeah.
And we're losing right now, right? So it's like we don't know where we're going, right? So again,
it can be
right?
Yeah. I think class struggle, it can be quite a cyclical analysis as opposed to like a deterministic and stages. And I think that gets to one of the questions that was raised, right? Which is, let me see if I can find it here. Here we go. So Darren, Reverend Darren, good to see you, bud. The other question of this text is Robinson's historical materialism mentioned in the preface and in this chapter, and the Robin D.G. Kelly's seeming dismissal. What is the historical materialism being set aside, right? And I think this is where I often struggle a little bit reading Robinson and Kelly with regard to historical materialism, because what they seem to want to define as historical materialism is not what I think of as historical materialism. It's like it tends to be more focused on the stagism that is present within, say, the Communist Manifesto. Again, like, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, communism, right? That these are stages that are kind of inevitably will develop. And there's some other elements of it too that perhaps will kind of unravel throughout it. He dealt with some of them in the text, but I don't think that. And people brought up the publication by Luna Oy of, I have one of them here, but there's the curriculum, the basic principles of Marxism, Leninism. This one's more on dialectical materialism, and there's a part 2 that's more on historical materialism. And I think those are better sources in certain ways to actually look at it, because I don't think of historical or dialectical materialism as being necessarily beholden to any individual set of, like possible misconceptions, for instance, that, Marx or Engels might have had at some point about the way things would proceed. I don't think of them either, though, as systems that can predict the future, right? Which some people do have that kind of argument too, of like historical materialism can tell us what's going to happen next. That is like,
yeah. Well, yeah, and then the critique that they had was that this, if we do that status approach, we're leaving certain workers or certain people behind, right? So the idea that because of these historical materialism, their argument was that the Africans, that the enslaved weren't revolutionary because they weren't in the stage they were in the past. They were primitive accumulation, right? And so that stage's history, as you said, was the critique, right? That if we take that approach, we're looking at certain people from as the past, and they're not necessarily the present or the future. And that was that's the critique that they had. That again, some might have, some Marxists might tend towards that direction, right? That view certain areas as backward, or someone that can't really provide an alternative. But I don't. That's not my approach to that, right? But yeah.
Yeah, no, me neither. I mean, I think there are a lot of, what I would say is there's a lot of people who will say that they are doing historical materialism, and I think that they're just doing, it is kind of like they're doing some mystical silliness, to some extent. And that it is more, the study of the history of class struggle and the study of the way that people in different periods of history respond to their environment, right, and so on. And so material conditions, again, like influencing, society, influencing rebellion, and, and on. But that's very. I'm making quite an abstraction there, that it actually involves a lot more than that.
Yeah. But again, I think that was the critique, right? That a certain formula of historical materialism abandons or erases certain struggles and certain histories, right? But again, I think there's been enough Marxists since this book, and even before this book, that were already doing that work, that are not highlighted, or those taking the Marxist approach.
All right. When Ho Chi Minh was in the Socialist Party in France, they were debating whether to join the Second or Third International. He asked who supported the liberation of the colonies, today neocolonialism, right? And that's the thing, is like a lot of the influence of Lenin, right, and of these anti-colonial struggles, it did come up against these different, these Marxist positions that Robinson talks about in Black Marxism, or here, right, where there are positions, because what we think of Marxism is this huge, historical thing full of all kinds of successes and failures and dead ends and bad attempts. And that's, again, the scientific approach, is to be able to look at that history and say, those bad lines need to be confronted and thrown out, right? Which is part of always was my frustration greatly with the third section of Black Marxism, is that rather than Robinson saying, that I disagree with, the way the Communist Party, went with the Popular Front, and the, uniting against fascism around World War II, because it threw out the Black Belt thesis, right? Rather than like laying that out and making an argument on that front, which would still be, a tricky argument, right? Because of course you deal with the USSR confronting, fascism and annihilation in there and like, all of that. But rather than laying out that argument, it just sort of becomes a like, this is why people walked away. And so anyways, yeah. People like my jargon, the say shit thing. Stephen will be right back. This is, yeah, I appreciated this, Darren.
Can I
I found it.
before we
Yeah,
go into that one,
yeah,
the Ho Chi Minh part, I think that's, that's the important aspect here. I think if you think of Ho Chi Minh, you think of Frantz Fanon, all these dudes were confronting these communist parties, right? They and not necessarily abandoning them or necessarily like never mind, or like Ho Chi Minh, waged armed struggle, but with that lens of national liberation. Fanon was critiquing the French communists, saying y'all ain't siding with the with the Algerian struggle because we don't look like your struggle. And there's I forgot which one of his books has a really good essay that he wrote, like towards the Algerian left, and it's almost timely because it's kind of like speaking to like the North American left, towards like Gaza and Palestine. But again, I don't think Cedric he wasn't part of a political organization, a revolutionary political organization. But the questions he's bringing up, or the things for us to think about and consider, were very similar to the questions and things that these other dudes were doing, right? These other folks were pushing us to think about, right? He's just doing more of an intellectual history of the past, while these other dudes were actually involved in organizing.
So appreciate Reverend Darren bring up this point. It's interesting the term Judeo-Christian is used when that was not really a thing yet at the time of Hegel. It wasn't a thing yet at the time of Marx or Engels either. It's like a post-World War II, terminology actually. And I think what he's saying is that there is this messianism in both Judaism and Christianity. But Darren adds here that it seems a little sloppy to combine these traditions and equate them with a philosophical messianism, which is apparently present in German achievements, but somehow still arriving or elides the fact that Judaism is expectant, meaning their Messiah has not come yet, and Christianity is based on Messiah manifested and present in spirit. The understanding of a second coming with Christians Robinson mentions a question. So, Darren, I would love to delve into that more deeply with you, honestly, because Darren has also read, I think, the Norman Cohn book that Robinson references a lot, which deals with, messianism, within Western movements and so on. And it is a point that, as mentioned, I think Benji mentioned it as well, is that Domenico Lacerdo, in his book on Western Marxism, deals with the messianism quite a bit too, and deals with how it was a problem for the Russian Revolution because they had all of these folks who had messian expectations that when the revolution came, that they could just go live on their farm and have their little 3-person commune. And Lenin and then Stalin were like, no, we need to like develop these productive forces and, build things up. So we need you all to get into the factories or to participate in this other type of collective agriculture or whatever else, right? And that there was a lot of tension there because some people thought that the revolution would just be, we'd be in heaven now, right? We'd just leap into communism and we could just, do whatever we want kind of thing. Because of what those messianic views in our heads, what relationships that we have to those, which is partly a part of that religious indoctrination over time as well. And how does Marx and some of his descriptions, maybe also give people that impression, or they could think, yeah, that's what I want. I want that, and So you move into this idealism as opposed to having to deal with, okay, now we're in this stage of our revolution and we have to do certain things for the benefit of this whole society that we may not all agree on either, right? And those kind of questions. And so that stuff's really important, I think, and it's important into also why Western Marxists often critique revolutions that happen in places in the third world, right, or anti-colonial revolutions, because they see it as not delivering their idea of what socialism or communism should look like, right? And they don't, not taking into account that they're confronting imperialism, they're dealing with their own material conditions and contradictions in their societies, and that this is a hard process and it's a long road, right? So yeah. The linear stages theory of history leading to socialism is at odds with the histories of previously existing socialistic indigenous communities. Yeah, this is part of the issue. And also it's something that like Marx, I think, was much more flexible on towards the end of his life in like examining different societies and saying like, yeah, there's some seeds there of something that's really, interesting and has a lot of potential. And again, like I point to the work of Chris Gilbert on his book in particular on the commune or nothing, because he does a really cool job there of incorporating in indigenous systems and beliefs within Venezuela, the Black Maroon histories of like communal living and so on, with this kind of Marxist or scientific influenced approach that the PSUV and other organs are trying to take in Venezuela. And I think that there's a lot to be taken there. And I think that some of the best of the socialist traditions are trying to say, like, again, to this, like, we don't need to throw out all this other stuff just because it's not, scientific socialism or whatever. How do we bring these things together?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it goes back to the work of Jose Carlos Mariátegui. This guy was saying that in the 30s, right? That, 20s, that the socialism in Latin America is going to look distinct, and it's going to have different indigenous traditions and histories that are going to shape how it develops, right? So again, this has been something that's been engaged with since for way back, right? It's not something that's new or that they weren't ever questions or thoughts about that, right? I think that's always been part of that. I was thinking earlier when you were saying about Marx and what he was offering to people to be like this feeling of like that, that's again, it goes about when was he writing? What was he writing, right? If you think about the Communist Manifesto, that's what it is. But if you read Capital is very, again, it's understanding the mode of production. It's not really giving. It's a pamphlet. It's not necessarily a pamphlet. It's an actual study of the mode of production and the critique of political economy. So there's different approaches to what you're reading, right? If you read his essays on the Civil War in France or the 18th Brumaire, right? These are historical studies. So it's different things that he writes in different approaches. Right?
Totally. Yeah, this was a thing about again, like when we're talking about the church and and within Europe, yeah, absolutely. Paying our debts, right? So the yeah, all of that. Marx gave the Western thought a way out of sterile materialism and idealism opposition and a way to rejoin the rest of the world, right? Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, ultimately, I think that not only he's a humanist, and he's also, but he was critical of the humanism that he was coming up against within Europe as well. Robinson said their African cultures, this is related to Black Marxism, fortified and shaped their resistance to slavery and more generally their desire to make a better life for themselves, right? And I think I do think it's important to understand all of the places where people's motivation comes from, and to think about how can all of that be directed in the right place, and not, we can't expect that we're going to be able to change everybody's mind, right? Like, you just come over to our side and think the way that we think, and we can do the thing. It is, as you've talked about, with correct handling of contradictions among the people, and Lenin, in many ways, I think, was expert at this, of like working with different movements and he worked with churches, right? Like he has all this critique, right, against the church and clerics and things like that, right? It comes up, and yet he was working with a prominent minister during the Russian Revolution, right? Because that guy had a lot of followers, and they could work together, and it was close enough in terms of what they wanted and what their critiques were that they could find a common cause.
Yeah. And again, in revolutions, Marxist revolutions or revolutions that take a scientific socialist lens are oftentimes against the church because of their property holding, against their not just because of the beliefs of the church, but also because of what the church represents, the wealth and power of the church that oftentimes uses it against counter-revolutionary ends, right? I think of Cuba as an example of Cuba. The fact that the church, they went against the church, not because again they were so rigid scientific socialists. It was because the church was trying to get rid of the revolution. The church was working with the CIA to get rid of the revolution. They had to ban the church at that point, right? They had to kick out the church. Then they brought it back later. Right now, if you go to Cuba right now, there's a whole bunch of Catholics in Cuba, right? So it's like yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's part of what's often missed, and it's one of the things that I appreciate about, for instance, Vox Oma has been doing these posts about Islam and Marxism, right? And talking about like you have to read the critique of religion within Marx very much through the lens of the church that he's confronting within the societies that he lives in, right? And so it's different. Those questions have to be dealt with locally within the spaces where you're struggling based on the relationship of the church in those communities to either your oppression, right, or to your liberation potentially, even. Yeah. All right. Also, spiritual systems are often misunderstood as simply ideal and not material due to seeing them through Christian eyes. Right. Yeah. Justin, good to see you, my friend. Thanks for becoming a member. So Justin says, I'm curious, using what I infer as Robinson's criteria for selection, which is to have been in one and then be against formal communist parties, what Black women might meet the criteria. Yeah. I mean, there are some of the people who, I think even some of the folks that are in Sharice Burton Stelly's book were a part and then left. Queen Mother Audley Moore would be one, who we did an episode on, or Josh did an episode with recently, where she was in the Communist Party during the period when they had the Black Belt thesis. And when they abandoned it, she left, and she basically took that to develop, New African, the Republic of New Africa and a lot of the New African approaches. And, she retained, I don't know fully, I haven't read the book yet, but I don't know fully the degree to which she retained, communism as an imperative, but I understand that she always kept her critique of capitalism and kind of, belief in kind of socialistic practices also as a result, partly of, stuff she'd studied and done when in the CPUSA, and I'm sure for other reasons as well. But like within the New African tradition in the United States, there are people who are explicitly like, I'm a New African communist. And there are people who say, I'm a New African and I actually think we could, do some capitalism, and so there's different within that national movement, there are different strands of thought, all right. Maybe add a criteria and not be a nationalist. Yeah, I don't know. I have to think on this one, Justin. I bet that there are, but I don't think I have enough of a. I don't know if Claudia Jones at any point left. I don't. I certainly don't think she ever renounced.
No,
communist organizing. So I don't know. I'm sure that there are, though, Black women communists who were in the Communist Party who left at a certain point, and my guess is a lot of times that would be because of a line that was shifted and that they argued against, that they lost out on and didn't want to be a part of it anymore because they no longer saw their community struggles as represented within what that party wanted to do at the time. But could be for other reasons, of course, too.
But I think that's the point that's really important, right? When we're thinking about organizing in parties, the line struggle, right? There's always line struggles in parties, and they're going to develop these contradictions, and you know, these questions and conversations that conversation we're having now are within parties. What issues need to be raised, which one's the primary contradiction at that moment, right? How do you work with the masses in different ways, right? And that's going to bring different line struggles that people are going to leave. People are going to leave and try to either create their own organizing or, you know, do alternative ways. But I think the analysis stays, right? The anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist analysis, I think, oftentimes stays with a lot of these people.
So, Tony, just quickly, the line I'm referring to specifically, it's not the only one, but, for a period of time, the Communist Party, and Harry Haywood and folks like this, and it was supported also by the Communist Party in the USSR, Lenin and, Stalin, etc. They supported a black belt thesis, meaning the idea of self-determination for black people, thinking about the land of, the South, right? In particular, they have there's even specific demographic studies and stuff like that done about, what parts and all of that. But to say that this is the land that black folks have worked historically, it's the land where they constitute the majority of people, right? And so therefore, for their national determination, this would be the area of the nation. And there's debates. Sorry, there's debates about how serious CPUSA was about that line, whether it was just a strategy to recruit more black folks into the party. There's a lot of that kind of thing. That's kind of the way that some of the people who left felt like it wasn't sincerely believed by many of the white communists there, but that, so they felt that it was a little bit, they felt used, I guess, in that way, right? But there was a lot of organizing, which again, Hammer and Hoe is a good book to look at some of the organizing that was going on during the time of the Black Belt thesis. And, there were black people that were involved in the party and in organizations associated with the party, both in the South, but also in, Harlem and other places related to that line. And they did abandon that line at part during a period when the position of the Communist Party kind of internationally was that you needed to basically shore up all of the forces that you could against fascism within Europe, against Hitler and Mussolini, most specifically, right, in order to defend communism, because the idea of Nazism, if you study it, right, was basically to turn every Russian person into a slave, essentially, or to kill them. And so that was the threat that the most powerful communist country at the time faced. And so a lot of the parties, really, I think probably all of them, but most of them around the world kind of took a line to support that, right? And that meant in some cases that you abandon certain struggles or contradictions, which might make it harder for you to develop some kind of national progressive front against fascism in those kind of views. And so that's kind of painting, it in very broad strokes. What I would always say about that is that it's history, right? It's a historical, it's something that happened within a specific set of historical conditions, and it's approach that people took within history. Ultimately, the communists, were essential in the winning of World War II, and without that, who knows what kind of world would have developed immediately after. But at the same time, obviously, there's a lot of good reason, I think, particularly about black folks in America, why, they were living under Jim Crow. They were facing a kind of fascism here in the United States, and they didn't necessarily want to align with, you know, white racists basically on this kind of national front level. And so like it's it's a complicated history that I think sometimes people use as too much of like, this is what communists will always do. They'll turn their back on
Yeah.
black folks when the time comes or something like that, rather than looking at it as like a very specific historical event in which, tens of millions of people died, but yeah.
Mhm. Well, that there were black communists that also were with this line,
Yes, that stayed.
right?
Yep.
The state, right? That believed that this
Yep.
was the line that we had to take at that moment. Again, maybe later on they were like that was a mistake, but at that moment that was the line, right? I think that's the part that oftentimes, I think in organizations, that's the importance of the line, of what line you take. And again, democratic centralism, that's the line you take and that's what you got to follow, right? And some folks just are not okay with that, right? But again, if you believe in organization, if you believe in leading a movement, oftentimes you have to take a line. And that line, again, later, like you said, in history, you could look back and be like, oh, that wasn't the correct moment. But at that moment, you thought it was the correct moment.
And I think it's hard to argue one way, like it has
Yeah,
consequences,
yeah, exactly.
right? And we could say those consequences suck, and it hurt the Communist Party long term,
Yeah,
in the United States specifically. But then you have to also think about it in a global context,
right.
right? And like, was it the right thing to support the development of a socialist and communist bloc and the preservation of it during that period, right? And like, so there are things that we can't fully weigh, like how does that all play out if they do something different,
Yeah,
but yeah, so it is, and to your point, that is the way that democratic centralism works. And again, I would point people to that book, Organize, Fight, Win by Charisse Bernstelli and Jody Dean, because in it there are a bunch of black communists talking about this line,
yeah,
sometimes debating it internally, sometimes after it's over and they go back talking about how it was a mistake or what they need to do differently, right? But there was a discourse, there was a debate about this, and the people within the book, at least some of them, stayed throughout all of that and continued to organize and to argue and all of that. Yeah.
yeah. Then later comes that Sino-Soviet split. That was a line struggle between the Soviet Union and China, right? Like, what was the different visions that they had for a socialist society, right? That was a big one that split the movement abroad, right?
Yeah. Um Yeah, so Stone Brigand brings up, Robinson praised Marxism and Marxists, even in Black Marxism. He didn't reject it, at least not fully. Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of, maybe we could talk a little bit about this. I mean, you have a better vantage point than most people around, you know, Robinson's engagement with Marxism in a kind of day to day and all of that. All I would say is that obviously he was quite engaged in it. He read a lot of, from this book, from Black Marxism, from other work of his. He was very interested in, from what I can gather through stuff, and even what he says in this book, he's very interested in the prospects for socialism. How does, theories of revolution, how does revolution happen? How do we get to where we want to go? Um, and so I think Marxism was something obviously that he had to relate to because it was the primary sort of Western developed source of these theories, and he engaged with it a lot. Clearly, he has disagreements, right, with it, and clearly he thinks that Marx, Lenin, Engels all get things wrong. I mean, everybody gets things wrong. This is not a really a radical thesis there. Um, but I think that you're right to point out, Stone, that like there are moments, you see him in this text, you see him in Black Marxism, where he does express resonant or reverence or agreement or understandings that the goals, like one of the things he said in the beginning of this is like the goals are still as urgent as they were, and so, yeah.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I think I just yeah I think it's really interesting that there's folks that say that these texts are anti-Marxist or anti-communist. And when I think of anti-Marxist, I think anti-communists, I think of the U.S. I think of those intellectuals of the U.S. state those are the anti-communists that you should be thinking about. I think Cedric's work was more just again, as someone that upholds the Marxist tradition myself, is like it was more of like reminding you of the blind spots of your own analysis, right, and thinking through those blind spots, right, or pushing us to think about them. And so I've always read it, and maybe I'm just being generous because I knew him. But again, also knowing him allowed me to ask him those questions. Obviously, I never said, "Are you anti-communist?" I never asked him that question. But the conversations we had was never about anti-communism. It was about how we advance this analysis. How do we advance the perspective? At the moment when I was around him, I was still part of the youth party of the FMLN, which is the leftist party of El Salvador at that time, which is between 2008, 2013. And so, I was engaged in Marxist-Leninism and its ideas of Marxist-Leninism, and then eventually more Marxist-Leninism, Maoism, and these ideas, right? And it's like, and I never felt hostility towards me engaging him through that lens, right? It was more of like, let's talk about these ideas. Let's talk about what is the conclusion of your analysis take you to, and what might be some blind spots in that analysis, right? And again, it was the development. It could have been, you could see it as like an intellectual exercise of how understanding the world, but it was also helping me think about like, well, how do I approach my own organizing and my own understanding of the world? And again, for that analysis for me was really helpful, right? To continue developing my own lens, and to this day still continuing to develop my own lens as we're talking now, right?
Yeah, one of the things that Ruth Wilson Gilmore said to us when we interviewed her and kind of asked her about Robinson and historical materialism and all of this, because she is somebody who identifies very much with the Marxist tradition, with, historical materialism. She wrote the preface, to Lenin's Imperialism and the National Question when Verso republished it. She's into all this stuff, right? And she said, well, do you think that he would have asked me to write a preface to one of his books if he was avowedly anti-communist to such an extent that,
Yeah.
So she said that, but she also said that he was critical of anything that he thought was sloppy.
Yeah.
That he was always, that he had, I guess the phrase didn't suffer fools, right? But but basically that if there are blind spots or aspects of the analysis that he thinks are lacking, are false, are based on mythologies, etc., he's gonna call that out, and that's part of who he is.
Yeah.
What I think is interesting in sort of in my read of some of this is, again, that in doing that with relation to Marxism or communism, I don't find that he does a lot in terms of, as I said at the beginning, contextualizing what these things were written for and for what purpose, that might give us a little bit of an understanding into okay, well, who are these people talking to right now, and why are they saying things the way that they're saying them, which I think just adds another layer always as we look at this, because I do think there's a big difference between, for instance, the work that Marx is doing in Capital versus if we look at the Communist Manifesto, right? Or some of his earlier work, right, before he developed certain analyses or understandings and so on. And same thing with Lenin. There's a difference between imperialism and what is to be done, right, in terms of what he's wrestling with, how he approaches the text, and so on. So yeah.
And their development, right? The development of their analysis, right? Same thing with Cedric, right? Cedric's readings. If we read his book, we read Black Marxism, but then you read Forgeries of Memory and Meaning. Very different how it develops, right? And if you read the essays, his essays again on Almir Cabral, on Frantz Fanon, like I mentioned, those are really great essays to show that materialist analysis that he was engaging, right? And throughout his text, he's again, whether he critiques Marx, he's also building on Marx. His essay on the Jewish question, he really builds on that question. Really has a really good sharp analysis on the Jewish question, right? To analyze, the Negro, right? So it's I think that those are examples of not necessarily his anti-communism or anti-Marxism, but his critique of it. And I think critique again, critique could be ongoing critique. It could just become critique for critique's sake. But I think in this case, the critique that he's making is, again, to advance our understanding of it, right? I think, or maybe for me, because again, some others might read it as just, this is just a critique just to avoid our engagement of it. For me, it was never to avoid the engagement; it's to expand my engagement. And unfortunately, I do see on that other end the critique that's valid from some scholars, right? Some folks that are saying, you folks read Black Marxism and don't read Marx anymore, or don't do a political economy because they read Black Marxism. And I think, yeah, I'm sure there's folks out there that are like that, and it's unfortunate, right? That you pick up this text and you use it as a way of saying, nope, I don't got to read Marxism or anything that Marxists say, because Cedric Robinson already told you that it's not enough, right? And I think that's also a big mistake, and that's a failure of work of developing a broader analysis, right? That again, he was wanting us to engage these materials, not necessarily discredit them.
Yeah. So Justin brought up this book, the Vietnamese study. It's actually the Vietnamese textbook, as I understand it, for dialectical materialism. Places an emphasis on German language for scientific socialism, which emphasizes a pursuit of research and theory. And I think this is part of the thing that also gets missed sometimes, is that things are lost in translation sometimes. So I have that annotation here. Says, in common usage, the word science in English has a relatively narrow definition, referring to systemically acquired objective knowledge pertaining to a particular subject. But Wissenschaft, which is, apologies if my French or my German's wrong, but that's the word that Marx actually used, refers to a systematic pursuit of knowledge, research, theory, and understanding. Wissenschaft is used in any study that involves systematic investigation. And so scientific socialism is only an approximate translation of wissenschaftlich Sozialismus. So scientific socialism can be understood as a body of theory which analyzes and interprets the natural world to develop a body of knowledge which must be constantly tested against reality, with the pursuit of changing the world to bring about socialism through leadership of the proletariat. So that's their definition. But I think it's very helpful, right? Because it can get us beyond getting caught up or hung up on, this term science and what we think about this term science. All right. I'll fire through a few other quick things. So Lacerda also critiques the unconscious Christian messianism of much Marxism. Yes. And I know we'll get into some of this stuff as we dig through this. The good thing about the first book on the Vietnam model is that it gives specific categorical pairs, content and form, general and private. So that what is meant by dialectical materialism becomes clearer, specific. Agreed. All right.
I would say these two books are good too. I think the basic course and the fundamentals in political economy, these are useful to think about those in conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. In Class Struggle, Domenico Lacerda talks about how Marx wasn't anti-religious in the case of the Irish struggle, but said that religion and their institutions have a class character. Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing. I mean, I think you can get really hung up on what did these folks say in one specific context or time, and then you look at it later and they're saying something different. And I mean, Robinson somewhat says this in terms of Lenin, of saying he was so programmatic that he wasn't aware of some of the contradictions within his own work. I would probably say he probably was aware of it, but he's like, something different's going on now. So this is the line that we're pushing at this time. Whereas like back then we were focused on something else, or I was wrong in that point. And, this is what we need to push now. And I think that's the thing, is you can't go back to any of this stuff, which is something, again, that, a lot of people who think that they're Marxists do, which is that they look for that holy writ or that scripture that comes from Marx or Engels or Lenin and says, well, they said this, so we got to do it this way. And he's like, no, that doesn't make any sense. I find people all the time who dismiss Marx, yet don't realize that you have to read Marx. Folks get bogged down in dismissing him when it's obvious they never read Capital in the first place. Yeah. Please read Marx. Read Marx, read Lenin, read Engels. Like, if you get nothing else. I mean, I think that's one of the funny things. Like, I always want to do these discussions on Cedric Robinson because people talk about, his work, or in this case of this book, they don't talk about it that much. But it's like he wouldn't want anybody to just read him and then to use him as a reason why they don't need to read other things, as you've already said.
Yeah.
All right. All right. I think that is good. We can kind of wrap up there. Sorry if I didn't get to some of the comments or questions of the chat. I appreciate very much all of the engagement. We will be back next week for the next section. All of that stuff, if it's not in the show description, the link to the Patreon post, which is a public post, is in the show description, which has it. We're reading up until I think page 56 or something like that next week. So we'll get into a lot more and come back with more. So
yeah,
anyways,
appreciate y'all. Appreciate everyone that's stayed on and just the engagement, And again, if you guys are reading with us, bring some thoughts into the next week, bring some ideas that you are thinking through, or some not just questions, but comments and thoughts, that you also are engaging with,
Yeah, and if the character limit on YouTube makes things challenging, either leave it as a comment or leave it, go to the Patreon post, leave it as a comment, go to our Patreon and ask for our Discord, and I'll give it to you there, and you can send it to me on there. So there's various ways that you can connect with us and let us know questions that you have or passages that you want us to kind of like dig into more. We're happy to do so. We look forward to doing this with you, and that would be fun.
All right. Peace, y'all.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. Appreciate you, man.
Sure.